They say an alpha without a pack is just a man with teeth. King Kalen Virex learned that truth the night his own council voted to exile the woman who saved 7 children from a slaver's wagon. 3 seconds to cut iron chains. 3 words to shatter an empire. She stays here. Now enemies sharpen their knives and allies bare their throats. Because power without compromise is just another word for war. If you want to see what happens when a king chooses instinct over empire, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my pack is watching from. The pine forest at the border of Stormfall Dominion didn't care about borders. Trees grew where they wanted, roots splitting stone and empire alike. Sable crouched in the undergrowth, knees sinking into mud that smelled of rust and rot, watching the wagon creak to a halt 50 yards ahead. Her breath came shallow, controlled. The kind of breathing you learn when being heard means being dead. 7 children. She'd counted them through the slats as the wagon rolled past her camp 2 hours before dawn. Small fingers gripping wood, eyes that had already learned not to cry. The driver climbed down, a thick-necked man whose beard couldn't hide the scar that split his face from temple to jaw. He pissed against a tree, humming something that might have been a song once. His partner stayed on the bench, crossbow across his lap, scanning the tree line with the lazy confidence of a man who'd made this run 100 times. Sable's hand found the knife at her belt. 8 inches of folded steel, the handle worn smooth from a decade of use. She'd bought it in a market in Greymarch from a woman who'd lost 3 fingers to a forge accident. The woman had wrapped it in oilcloth and said, "This blade doesn't forgive hesitation." Neither did the next 30 seconds. She moved through the underbrush like smoke, each footfall placed with the precision of someone who'd mapped terrain for warlords and merchants who'd kill you for getting their supply lines wrong. Cartography wasn't just drawing maps. It was understanding how land moved, how it breathed, how to use it. The driver was still humming when she reached the wagon. The chains binding the children weren't complex, just iron links looped through a bolt in the wagon bed. Built for speed, not security. She wedged the knife point into the first link and twisted. Metal groaned. One of the children gasped. The driver's humming stopped. Sable wrenched the blade hard left, and the chain separated with a snap that echoed like a gunshot. She grabbed the nearest child, a girl, maybe 9, with matted black hair, and shoved her toward the tree line. Run. The driver came around the wagon fast, knife already drawn. He was bigger, heavier, used to using his weight like a weapon. Sable didn't give him the chance. She drove her shoulder into his solar plexus and felt his breath explode out. He stumbled back and she followed, blade rising. Not to kill, killing made noise, drew attention, but to disable. She opened his hamstring with a quick slash and he went down screaming. The partner with the crossbow was already shouting, fumbling to reload. Sable grabbed the iron chain she'd just broken and swung it like a whip. It caught him across the face and he toppled backward off the bench, crossbow clattering into the dirt. 3 seconds, maybe 4. The children were scattering into the forest, bare feet slapping mud. All except one. A boy, younger than the others, frozen in the wagon bed with eyes like shattered glass. Sable reached for him, and that's when she felt it. The air changed. Not wind, not weather. Something deeper. The kind of shift that happens when a predator enters a clearing and every living thing suddenly remembers its prey. She turned. King Kalen Virex stood at the edge of the road, 20 paces away, and the world bent around him. He wasn't tall in the way of stories, maybe 6'2", lean in the way of men who'd learned that muscle without speed was just weight. Dark hair shot through with silver at the temples, eyes the color of winter storms. He wore no crown, no royal markings, just a black coat that moved with him like it was part of his skin. But the wolves at his flanks, 3 of them, each the size of a warhorse, they told you everything you needed to know about who held power here. Sable's hand tightened on her knife. The blade suddenly felt very small. Kalen's gaze moved from her to the bleeding driver to the broken chains. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that didn't need volume. What law gives you the right to interfere with commercial transport in my territory? Not a question, a challenge. Sable straightened, forcing her spine to lock even as every instinct screamed at her to run. The law that says children aren't cargo. Commercial transport. That's what they called it now. That's what empires did. They turned horror into paperwork, gave it official seals and merchant codes. She'd seen it in every territory she'd mapped. The language changed, but the chains stayed the same. Kalen stepped forward, and the wolves moved with him, a synchronized threat that made her throat tight. You're not from Stormfall. I'm from everywhere. I draw maps. He stopped 3 paces away, and she could feel the weight of his attention like a physical thing, a cartographer who breaks iron chains. That's not in your professional charter. The boy behind her whimpered, and Sable shifted, putting herself between him and the king. Professional charters don't account for decency. Something flickered across Kalen's face. Not quite a smile. Not quite approval. Decency is expensive in Stormfall. People who can't afford it usually end up in chains themselves. Then I'll pay the price. The words came out harder than she intended, but she didn't take them back. Couldn't. Not with the boy's terrified breathing at her back. Not with the memory of 7 pairs of small hands gripping wooden slats. Kalen studied her with the intensity of a man who'd built an empire by reading weakness in others. She forced herself to hold his gaze, to not flinch. Alpha psychology was simple at its core. Show fear, and you became prey. Show defiance without foundation, and you became a target. The narrow path between them was paved with broken spines. You know what happens to people who defy trade law in Stormfall, he said. I know what happens to people who look away from atrocity. They sleep well and wake up hollow. His eyes narrowed. You think yourself a moral authority. I think I'm a woman with a knife who's had enough of men who hide behind legal codes while children disappear into the dark. One of the wolves growled, low and rumbling. Kalen raised a hand and it fell silent. The control was absolute, effortless, the kind of dominance that didn't require thought. He looked past her to the boy in the wagon, then to the forest where the other children had fled. When his gaze returned to her, something had shifted. What's your name? Sable. Just Sable. Just Sable. He turned to the bleeding driver who'd managed to drag himself against a wagon wheel, face pale with shock and blood loss. Get your cargo out of my sight. If I see this wagon in Stormfall territory again, I'll feed you to the wolves personally. The driver's eyes went wide. My lord, the trade agreement with House Varn is void as of this moment. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. Tell Varn that if he wants to contest it, he can bring his objections to Blackwater Keep, in person. The driver swallowed hard, nodded. His partner was already stumbling to his feet, blood streaming from his broken nose. They hauled themselves onto the wagon bench and whipped the horses into motion, the vehicle lurching away down the road in a clatter of wheels and panicked breathing. Silence settled over the clearing like ash. Kalen turned back to Sable, and the weight of his attention made her skin prickle. You just cost me a significant trade agreement. You just saved 7 children from a life of horror. If that's not a fair exchange, your empire isn't worth the ink on your treaties. Bold words for someone who doesn't understand the architecture of power. I understand that power without conscience is just brutality with a crown. He stepped closer and she felt her pulse spike. This close she could see the scars on his hands, the silver threading through his dark hair, the way his jaw tightened when he was calculating risk. He smelled like pine smoke and something wilder, something that made her hindbrain scream warnings about apex predators. You freed those children, he said quietly. Now what happens to them? They're loose in a forest full of wolves and worse. No food, no shelter, no protection. You've traded one form of death for another. The words hit like a fist because they were true. She'd acted on instinct, cut the chains, scattered the cargo, but she hadn't thought past the immediate violence, hadn't considered what came after the rescue. Her silence was answer enough. Kalen's expression shifted into something that might have been pity if it weren't so sharp. Instinct without strategy is just chaos wearing a hero's mask. If you're going to dismantle systems, you need to understand what holds them up. Then teach me. The words escaped before she could stop them, and his eyebrows rose fractionally. She pressed on. You clearly understand these systems. You profit from them. So teach me how to tear them down properly. Why would I do that? Because for 3 seconds you made a choice that contradicted your entire empire. You voided a trade agreement. You threatened a merchant house. You did it because somewhere under that crown and that calculated dominance, you remember what it feels like to choose right over easy. Something dangerous flickered in his eyes. You don't know anything about my choices. I know you could have let that wagon keep rolling. You didn't. The silence between them stretched taut. The wolves had gone still, watching their alpha with the focused attention of creatures who could sense shift before it happened. Kaelin turned abruptly, coat swirling. You'll come to Blackwater Keep. That's not a request. No, it's a consequence. You interfered with trade in my territory. You scattered valuable cargo. By law, I should have you executed or enslaved. Instead, I'm offering you a third option, which is, he looked back over his shoulder and the weight of his gaze made her breath catch. You want to learn how to dismantle systems. I'll show you. But understanding comes with a price. Everything does. Not like this. He gestured to the wolves and they moved to flank him. In Stormfall, knowledge is currency and ignorance is death. If you walk into my fortress, you walk into a world where every breath is a negotiation and every word is a weapon. You'll see things that will strip away whatever naive idealism made you cut those chains. I'm not naive. Then you're a fool. And fools in Stormfall don't last long. He started walking and the wolves followed. Sable stood frozen for a heartbeat, weighing options. She could run, disappear into the forest, back to her maps and her solitary camps, pretend this never happened. But the boy was still in the wagon behind her, trembling. And 6 other children were scattered in the woods, terrified and alone. And somewhere in the King's Challenge was an answer to a question she'd been asking her entire life. How do you fight a system when the system is everywhere? She grabbed the boy's hand and followed. Blackwater Keep rose from the landscape like a clenched fist of obsidian and iron. No softness, no grace. Just brutal geometry designed to break siege engines and spirits in equal measure. Sable had mapped fortresses across 3 kingdoms, and none of them carried the same weight of intentional menace. They'd walked for 6 hours, the boy, his name was Tam, clinging to her hand while the wolves ranged ahead, and Kaelin moved with the tireless efficiency of a man who'd long ago stopped measuring distance in discomfort. They'd found 4 of the other children within the first hour. The remaining 2 had vanished into the deep forest, and Kaelin had sent 2 of his wolves after them with instructions she couldn't hear. Now they stood at the base of the fortress as iron gates ground open, and Sable felt the full weight of her decision settling on her shoulders like a yoke. Kaelin didn't look back as he entered. Either you follow or you don't. But if you cross that threshold, there's no cartographer's neutrality to hide behind. You become part of Stormfall, and Stormfall doesn't forgive weakness. She looked down at Tam, his small face smudged with dirt and dried tears. What happens to him? That depends on what you're willing to sacrifice to ensure his safety. Not an answer. A test. Sable squeezed Tam's hand and walked through the gates. The courtyard beyond was controlled chaos. Soldiers drilling in formation, their movements synchronized with the precision of men who knew failure meant death. Servants moving between buildings with the practiced invisibility of people who'd learned that being noticed was dangerous. And everywhere, wolves. Dozens of them, ranging from cubs the size of hunting dogs to massive alphas that made the 3 with Kaelin look small. A woman emerged from the main keep, tall and sharp-featured, her dark hair pulled back in a severe braid. She wore leather armor fitted so precisely it looked like a second skin. Her gaze swept over Sable with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating threat levels. Kaelin gestured toward her. Commander Astrid Hale. She runs security for Blackwater. If she decides you're a liability, I won't stop her from acting on that assessment. Astrid's smile was all edges. How generous of you, my lord. She intercepted a cargo shipment. Freed 7 children bound for House Varn's pleasure estates. Astrid's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. Interesting. She looked at Sable directly. Do you understand the political implications of that action? I understand that children were in chains. Not what I asked. It's the only answer I have. Astrid exchanged a glance with Kaelin that carried entire conversations. He values that kind of moral simplicity. Finds it refreshing. I find it dangerous. Morality without context gets people killed. Sable met her stare. I've stayed alive this long, mapping trade routes for merchants who don't care if you live or die. Astrid stepped closer. This isn't the wilderness. This is court. And court is a different kind of forest, one where the predators wear silk and the poison comes in wine glasses. Then I'll learn quickly, or you'll die slowly. Astrid turned to Kaelin. Where do you want her? Guest quarters, east wing, post a guard, to keep others out or her in? Both. Astrid nodded and gestured to two soldiers who materialized from the flow of bodies in the courtyard. They were young, barely past 20, but they moved with the coiled readiness of fighters who'd seen violence. One of them, a woman with a scar bisecting her left eyebrow, took Tam's hand gently. The boy jerked back, pressing against Sable's leg. It's all right, Sable said, though she had no idea if that was true. They'll keep you safe. The scarred soldier crouched down to Tam's eye level. My name's Kira. I grew up in a place a lot like where you were headed. She pushed up her sleeve, revealing a brand on her forearm. Old scar tissue, deliberately burned. I got out too. You're safe here, I promise. The boy searched her face, looking for lies. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he let her take his hand. Kira led him toward a side building, murmuring something Sable couldn't hear. Kaelin watched them go, his expression unreadable. Kira was 11 when my father's men found her in a similar wagon. She's been with me for 14 years, one of my best tactical officers. You have a habit of collecting strays. I have a habit of recognizing value others overlook. He turned and started toward the keep. Follow me. The interior of Blackwater was all stone and shadow, corridors lit by torches that made the walls seem to breathe. They passed through a great hall where a massive table dominated the space, surrounded by high-backed chairs carved with wolf heads. Maps covered one wall, territories, trade routes, military positions. Sable's professional eye caught details. Recent updates, fresh ink, areas marked in red that suggested conflict zones. Kaelin noticed her attention. You see it. See what? The pattern. Most people look at maps and see borders. You see pressure points. It's what I'm trained for. Understanding how geography shapes power. Then you understand why Stormfall exists the way it does. He stopped in front of the map wall, one hand pressed against a section marked in dark red. We're surrounded by 3 kingdoms that would carve us apart if they sensed weakness. House Varn to the east, the Frostmark clans to the north, the Merchant Coalition to the south. Every trade agreement, every law, every chain you find morally reprehensible, they're all part of the architecture that keeps this empire from collapsing into civil war. So you build the empire on the backs of children. I build it on calculated compromises that keep millions alive. His voice hardened. You want to tear down the system. Fine. But first, you need to understand what replaces it. Because if Stormfall falls, those same children you saved will be swallowed by something worse. The clans practice ritual sacrifice. The coalition has labor camps where life expectancy is measured in months. House Varn, I get it. She cut him off. No good options, only degrees of horror. Now you're learning. She stepped closer to the map, tracing the borders with her eyes. There has to be a way to change this without perpetuating the same violence. If you find it, you'll be the first in 10,000 years of recorded history. The cynicism in his voice made her turn. You don't believe change is possible. I believe change requires power, and power requires compromise. The question isn't whether you'll get your hands dirty. It's whether you'll do it intentionally or accidentally. What's the difference? Intentional compromise serves a purpose. Accidental compromise just makes you complicit. Before she could respond, a door at the far end of the hall slammed open, and a man strode in, flanked by 2 advisors in formal robes. He was younger than Kaelin, maybe 40, with the kind of polished handsomeness that suggested calculated grooming. His clothes were expensive, but understated, wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Kaelin's posture shifted fractionally. Counselor Brennan. The man's gaze swept over Sable with cold assessment. So this is the disruptor, the woman who cost us the Varn agreement. She has a name. I'm sure she does. Brennan's smile was surgical. I'm more interested in why she's still breathing. Trade law is explicit about interference. Execution or enslavement, those are the options. I'm exploring a third option. There is no third option. That's why it's called binary law. Brennan moved closer, and Sable caught the scent of expensive cologne and barely suppressed rage. The council convenes in 2 hours. We'll be discussing this breach formally. The breach was necessary. Necessary. Brennan's laugh was sharp. You voided a trade agreement worth $300,000 in annual revenue because a cartographer with delusions of heroism decided to play savior. That's not necessary. That's self-indulgent. Kalen's eyes went flat, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. You're questioning my judgment. I'm questioning your priorities. Brennan gestured to Sable. She's a disruption, a liability. And you're treating her like she's valuable. She is valuable. Why? Because she cut some chains. Because she has moral convictions. Brennan's voice rose. Those convictions will get people killed. The Varn agreement included protection clauses. Military support if the Frostmark clans push south. Without it, we're exposed. Then we renegotiate from a different position. There is no different position. Brennan's face flushed. Varn will spread word that Stormfall breaks agreements on royal whim. Our credibility crumbles. Other houses will test our borders. And when the bodies start piling up, will your moral cartographer take responsibility? The silence that followed was absolute. Kalen walked toward Brennan with the slow, deliberate pace of a predator closing distance. When he spoke, his voice was soft, lethal. You forget yourself, counselor. I forget nothing. I remember what it cost to build this empire. I remember the sacrifices we made, the blood we spilled, and I won't watch it collapse because you developed a conscience. Get out. Brennan held his ground for 3 seconds, then 5. The advisors behind him had gone pale, eyes fixed on the floor. Finally, he inclined his head, just barely, and turned on his heel. The door slammed behind him hard enough to make the torches flicker. Sable let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. He's going to be a problem. He's been a problem for 6 years. Kalen's voice was tired. But he's also right. About what? Everything. The agreement, the exposure, the consequences. He turned to face her. This is what governance looks like. Every decision creates casualties. The only choice is which casualties you're willing to accept. And you chose me. I chose disruption. He studied her with that same intense focus. Because comfortable empires rot from the inside. Because sometimes the only way to find a new path is to burn down the old one. But mostly, he paused and something flickered across his face. Something vulnerable. Because when I watched you cut those chains, I saw something I haven't seen in years. What? Someone who remembered that power is supposed to serve purpose beyond its own perpetuation. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unexpected. Sable felt something shift, not quite trust, but maybe its foundation. A bell tolled from somewhere in the fortress. Deep, resonant. Council convenes in 2 hours, Kalen said. You'll attend. I'm not part of your government. You are now. He moved toward the door, then looked back. And Sable, when Brennan moves against you, and he will, don't expect me to save you. If you're going to survive here, you need to learn to fight your own battles. Some mentor you are. I'm not your mentor. I'm the man who owns the board you just stepped onto. The difference matters. He left her standing alone in the great hall, surrounded by maps of empires and the weight of choices she was only beginning to understand. The council chamber was built for intimidation. Circular, with a floor of polished black stone that reflected the faces of those standing on it like a dark mirror. 12 high-backed chairs arranged in a semicircle, each one occupied by someone whose power was written in the lines of their face and the calculation in their eyes. Sable stood in the center, acutely aware that she was the only one without a seat. Kalen occupied the largest chair, slightly elevated. To his right, Commander Astrid. To his left, Counselor Brennan, who watched Sable with the expression of a man planning violence. The others she didn't recognize, advisors, military commanders, trade ministers, each one studying her like she was a specimen under glass. Brennan stood first. For the record, I move for immediate enforcement of trade law. The accused interfered with legal commerce. The penalty is binary, execution or enslavement. A woman 3 seats down, elderly with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice, raised a hand. Counselor Brennan, the cargo in question was human. Children, specifically. Are we truly defending the trade of children as legal commerce? Brennan didn't miss a beat. We're defending the rule of law, Counselor Marin. The trade agreement with House Varn was ratified through proper channels. It included provisions for labor transfer, slavery, which is legal under Stormfall Trade Code, Section 7, Subsection 4. Marin's smile was thin. So we hide atrocity behind legal language. How civilized. If you have a problem with the trade code, petition for revision through the proper legislative process. Brennan gestured sharply. But the law as it stands is clear. This woman violated it. Punishment must follow or the entire framework collapses. A younger man, maybe 30, with the build of a soldier, leaned forward. And if the law itself is unjust, then change it through the proper channels, Brennan snapped. You don't get to pick which laws you follow based on personal morality. That's chaos. Kalen's voice cut through the argument like a blade. Enough. Instant silence. He stood, and the room seemed to contract around him. Counselor Brennan raises a valid point. The law was violated, but he conveniently ignores context. There is no context that justifies 7 children. Kalen's voice was soft, dangerous. Between the ages of 6 and 12, bound for estates where their life expectancy would be measured in years at best, hours at worst. The woman who freed them asked for nothing, expected nothing. She saw injustice and acted. And that makes her a hero. Brennan's sarcasm was thick. How touching. It makes her useful. Kalen looked directly at Sable. We've built an empire on calculated brutality and called it pragmatism. We've turned children into cargo and called it commerce. We've murdered conscience and called it strength. And in doing so, we've created exactly the kind of society that breeds rebellion. You're advocating for weakness. I'm advocating for evolution. He turned to address the full council. Stormfall survives because we're stronger than our enemies. But strength without adaptation is just momentum toward extinction. This woman represents something we've forgotten. The kind of instinct that doesn't calculate cost before acting. That's not weakness. That's a different kind of power. Marin spoke quietly. What are you proposing? Kalen's gaze swept to the council. I'm proposing we stop defending systems that compromise our humanity and start building ones that enhance it, beginning with the trade agreements that traffic in human lives. The chamber erupted, half the council on their feet, voices raised. Brennan's face had gone purple. You're advocating for economic suicide. Do you understand how many agreements would need to be renegotiated? How many trade partners would walk away? Then they walk. Kalen's voice cut through the noise. And we find partners who don't require us to become monsters. This is insanity. Brennan turned to the other counselors. He's letting emotion override strategy. One woman cut some chains and suddenly we're dismantling the entire trade framework. Not dismantling, redefining. Kalen moved down the steps toward Sable. Power isn't about domination. It's about choice. And I choose not to build an empire on the backs of children. Noble sentiment. Brennan's smile was vicious, completely impractical, but noble. Then make it practical. Kalen stopped in front of Sable. She's a cartographer. She understands systems, trade routes, pressure points. She can help us redesign the framework. She has no experience in governance. She has clarity, which is more than I can say for this council. Astrid stood slowly. My lord, I understand the impulse, but Counselor Brennan is right about the risks. If we move too quickly, we destabilize everything. Then we move carefully, but we move. And if the other houses unite against us, then we fight. Kalen's voice was flat. I'd rather face enemies at the border than build an empire I'm ashamed to rule. The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Brennan laughed, sharp and bitter. There it is, the truth. You're ashamed. So you're going to dismantle what your father built because your conscience finally caught up to your crown. My father built an empire on fear and called it order. I watched it hollow him out, made him cruel, made him... He stopped himself, jaw tight. Brennan leaned forward. Made him what? Strong enough to survive. Kalen's voice was cold. But I'm not interested in that kind of survival anymore. Then you're a fool. Brennan stood, gathering his robes. And fools don't keep thrones long. He strode toward the exit, his 2 advisors scrambling to follow. At the door, he turned back. When this collapses, and it will, remember that I warned you. The door slammed. In the silence that followed, Counselor Marin spoke quietly. That was a declaration of war. Kalen nodded. I know. What do you need from us? Support. Or, at minimum, neutrality. He looked at each counselor in turn. I'm not asking you to abandon pragmatism. I'm asking you to expand your definition of it. The young soldier who'd spoken earlier cleared his throat. What's her status? He nodded toward Sable. Guest. Prisoner. What? Advisor. Kalen's voice was firm. Under my direct protection. Brennan will move against her. He'll try. Astrid's expression was grim. He has support. At least 4 council members will back him. Maybe more. Then we'll deal with it. Kalen turned to Sable. You wanted to learn how to fight systems. Welcome to your first lesson. The council session dissolved into smaller conversations, counselors clustering in groups, whispering. Sable stood frozen in the center of it all, trying to process what had just happened. Kalen had just publicly defended her, had restructured his entire trade policy framework, had turned her into a fulcrum around which the Empire was starting to pivot, and she had no idea what she was doing. Astrid materialized at her elbow. Walk with me. They moved through corridors Sable was starting to recognize. The guest wing, the armory, the training grounds where soldiers drilled in formation. Astrid didn't speak until they reached a balcony overlooking the fortress's outer walls. You understand you're a weapon now. What? Kalen turned you into a symbol, the woman who made a king remember his conscience. Astrid's voice was clinical. Brennan will try to destroy you, not because of what you did, because of what you represent. I didn't ask to represent anything. Doesn't matter. You're not Sable the cartographer anymore. You're Sable the catalyst. And catalysts in Stormfall have a life expectancy measured in days. So what do? Learn. Fast. Astrid pulled a small knife from her belt, offering it handle first. Start with this. It's smaller than your camp blade, easier to hide. And in court, hidden weapons last longer than obvious ones. Sable took it, feeling the weight. I thought the king was supposed to protect me. He will, as long as you're useful. Astrid's gaze was steady. But the moment you become more liability than asset, he'll cut you loose. That's not cruelty. That's kingship. You don't trust him. I trust him completely. I just don't trust that his instincts and his empire's needs will always align. And when they don't, what? Someone has to make the hard choice. Astrid turned to leave, then paused. The children you freed, Tam and the others, they're in the East Barracks being fed and clothed. Kira's with them. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank the king. He's the one who gave the order. I'd have sent them to the labor camps. The casual brutality of it made Sable's breath catch. Why? Because sentiment is expensive and resources are finite. Astrid's expression didn't change. In Stormfall, survival isn't about being good. It's about being ruthless enough to protect what matters. You'll learn that. Or you'll die. She left Sable alone on the balcony, the small knife heavy in her hand and the weight of consequence settling on her shoulders like a sentence. Night fell over Blackwater Keep like a hammer. Sable sat in her guest quarters, a room larger than any tent she'd ever owned, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the forest, trying to process the last 12 hours. The council session, Kalen's defense, Astrid's warning, all of it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, watching the ground crumble. A knock at the door. She opened it to find Kalen standing in the corridor, still wearing the same black coat, looking exhausted in a way that made him seem almost human. Can't sleep. It wasn't a question. He walked past her into the room without waiting for permission, moving to the window. Neither can I. She closed the door. Why are you here? Because in about 6 hours, Brennan is going to petition the full council for your execution. He turned to face her. And I needed you to understand what that means. That I'm going to die. No. That you're going to fight. His expression was hard. I can protect you from legal challenges, but I can't protect you from political ones. If the council votes for your execution, I can refuse to enforce it. But that refusal will fracture my government. Half the council will walk. Trade agreements will collapse. The empire will be vulnerable. So you're telling me to run. I'm telling you to choose. He stepped closer. You can leave tonight. I'll provide escort to whatever border you want. You'll be safe. Or you can stay. Learn the systems you want to dismantle. Help me rebuild them. But if you stay, you become a player in a game where the stakes are measured in bodies and the rules are written in blood. Some choice. It's the only choice anyone in power ever gets. Survive or fight. There's no middle ground. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the weight he carried, the scars, the calculations, the cost of every decision visible in the lines around his eyes. Why do you care what I choose? Because I'm tired. His voice was quiet, tired of being the only one who remembers that power is supposed to serve purpose, tired of advisors who measure everything in gold and nothing in lives, tired of waking up every morning in an empire I built and finding it unrecognizable. Then change it. I'm trying. He gestured toward the fortress beyond the window. But changing systems from inside is like performing surgery on yourself. Every cut risks bleeding out, and I'm running out of blood. The vulnerability in his admission made something shift in her chest. This wasn't the Alpha King. This was just a man, hollowed out by choices and consequence and the weight of a crown that had never fit right. I'll stay. The words came out before she fully processed them, but she didn't take them back. Kalen's expression didn't change, but something in his posture eased fractionally. Then we have work to do. He pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat, spreading them on the small table. Trade agreements, all the contracts that include human trafficking provisions. 17 in total. We need to renegotiate everyone. In 6 hours. We have people who can expedite the process, but you need to understand the geography. He pointed to a map. House Varn controls the Eastern Pass. If we void the agreement without securing alternative routes, we lose access to the southern markets. That means food shortages, medicine shortages. People die. So we find alternative routes. There aren't any, not without going through Frostmark territory. And the clans won't negotiate with us. Why not? Because 3 years ago, my father executed their peace delegation for a treaty violation I later discovered was fabricated. He looked up from the map. I inherited that grudge along with the crown. Can you apologize? Apologies don't resurrect the dead. Sable studied the map, tracing borders with her finger. The Frostmark territory wrapped around Stormfall's northern border like a noose, impassable mountains to the west, hostile coalition states to the south, House Varn to the east. They'd built their empire in a cage. What if we didn't go through Frostmark territory? What if we went under it? Kalen frowned. What? She pointed to a mountain range on the northern border. These peaks are limestone. I've mapped similar formations in the Grey March territories. They're riddled with cave systems. Some of them run for miles. You want to build trade routes through unmapped cave systems. I want to survey them, see if they're viable. It's faster than negotiation and doesn't require trusting people who have every reason to want you dead. He studied the map, expression shifting from skepticism to calculation. It's dangerous. Cave collapses, flooding, predators, more dangerous than starvation. No. He looked at her directly. But close. Then we move fast, survey the caves, prove they're viable. Use that as leverage to renegotiate from a position of strength. And if they're not viable, then we find another way. But at least we'll know. Kalen was silent for a long moment. Then he started gathering the papers. I'll have a survey team assembled by dawn. I'm coming with them. Absolutely not. I'm a cartographer. This is literally what I do. You're also a political target. Taking you outside the fortress walls makes you vulnerable. I'm already vulnerable. At least in the caves, the threats are honest. The corner of his mouth twitched. Might have been a smile. You're either very brave or very stupid. Can it be both? This time, it was definitely a smile. Brief. Gone almost before she registered it. But real. He moved toward the door, then paused. Sable. What you did today, cutting those chains, you started something you can't stop. The empire is shifting. And when empires shift, people get crushed. I know. Do you? Because once we start renegotiating these agreements, once we signal that Stormfall is changing direction, every enemy we've ever made will test our borders. People will die. Maybe people you care about. And you'll have to live with that. I already live with it. Every map I've drawn has been used for trade, war, or both. Every time I've ignored atrocity in the name of professional neutrality, I've been complicit. She met his gaze. At least now I'm choosing my complicity deliberately. He studied her for a long moment, and she could see him calculating, weighing her value against her risk, her usefulness against her liability. Get some sleep, he finally said. Tomorrow we find out if this empire can evolve or if it just tears itself apart. He left, and Sable was alone with the maps and the weight of choices she was only beginning to understand. She didn't sleep. Instead, she studied the cave systems, memorizing formations and flow patterns, preparing for a survey that would either save an empire or bury them all. Dawn came gray and cold, turning the fortress into a study in shadow and stone. Sable met the survey team in the north courtyard, 5 people plus Astrid, who'd insisted on leading the security detail. The team included 2 experienced miners, a geologist, and a young woman named Sarah, who specialized in underground mapping. Kalen arrived as they were loading supplies, flanked by 2 wolves. He moved through the team, checking equipment with the practiced eye of someone who'd planned too many missions to take preparation lightly. He stopped in front of Sable. "You're sure about this?" "No, but I'm doing it anyway. That's either wisdom or madness. You said they were the same thing." He almost smiled. "Stay close to Astrid. If she tells you to run, you run. Clear. Crystal." He handed her something, a small silver pendant on a leather cord. It was warm from his hand. "Wear this. It marks you as under royal protection. If something happens, if you get separated, it might buy you time." She took it, feeling the weight. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." He turned to Astrid. "Bring them back. Or die trying." Astrid's voice was dry. The usual arrangement. They left through the northern gate as the sun broke over the tree line, turning the forest from black to green in slow revelation. The path to the mountain range was rough, winding through dense undergrowth and over streams swollen with snowmelt. Nobody spoke. The kind of silence that comes when every breath is measured and every sound could mean danger. They reached the cave entrance 3 hours later. A dark mouth in the limestone face, maybe 10 feet wide, exhaling cold air that smelled of minerals and time. Sarah moved forward first, pulling light orbs from her pack and tossing them into the darkness. They activated on impact, casting pale blue illumination that revealed a passage descending into the earth at a steep angle. "Looks stable." She turned to the team. "But we'll need to anchor rope every 20 feet. If the floor gives way, I don't want anyone falling into an abyss." They rigged the safety lines and started down. The cave swallowed them. Sable had been underground before. Old mines, natural caverns, places where the earth opened up and showed you its bones. But this was different. The passage twisted and branched, splitting into corridors that disappeared into darkness. The air was thin, each breath requiring effort, and everywhere the sound of water, dripping, flowing, pooling in chambers they couldn't see. Sarah called back measurements, and Sable marked them on her survey map, hand steady despite the cold and the growing realization that they were descending into something vast and unmapped. 2 hours in, the passage opened into a chamber so large their light orbs couldn't reach the ceiling. Stalactites hung like frozen lightning, and in the center, a pool of water so clear it looked like glass. Sarah moved to the edge, testing depth with a weighted line. 40 feet. Maybe more. She looked back at the team. "If we can prove this chamber connects to the eastern passages, we might have a viable route." One of the miners knelt at the water's edge, examining sediment. Fresh flow marks. This pool feeds from somewhere. If we can trace the source. The water erupted. A shape burst from the pool, massive, scaled, moving with the speed of something that had evolved in darkness and learned that hesitation meant death. It caught the miner in its jaws and dragged him under before anyone could react. Astrid's command cut through the shock. "Weapons. Now!" The creature surfaced again, the miner's blood turning the water dark. It was reptilian, maybe 20 feet long, with eyes that reflected their light like mirrors. Ancient, hungry. Sable fumbled for the knife Astrid had given her, knowing it was useless against something that size. The other miner had pulled a crossbow, but his hands were shaking too badly to aim. Astrid fired first. Her bolt caught the creature in the shoulder and it screamed, a sound that made the chamber ring like a bell. It dove again, and the water went still, too still. "Everyone back," Astrid ordered. Slow, no sudden movements. They retreated toward the passage they'd entered through, watching the water. Sarah was crying silently, her survey notes forgotten. The geologist had his hand pressed to his mouth, trying not to vomit. They made it 10 feet before the water exploded again. The creature came from a different angle this time, smashing into the chamber wall hard enough to crack stone. Astrid fired twice more, both bolts hitting center mass, but the creature barely slowed. It lunged for Sarah. Sable moved without thinking. She threw herself between the cartographer and the creature, the small knife rising in a grip that was pure instinct. The creature's momentum carried it forward, and the blade sank into the soft tissue under its jaw, driving up into the skull. They went down together, Sable pinned under a ton of thrashing muscle and scale and blood that tasted like copper and rot. The creature convulsed once, twice, then went still. Astrid hauled her out from under the corpse, hands checking for injuries with clinical efficiency. "You're bleeding." Sable looked down. Her shirt was torn, a long gash across her ribs that was only just starting to hurt. Not deep. "I'm fine. You're an idiot." But Astrid's voice carried something that might have been approval. She turned to the rest of the team. "We're leaving, now." The climb back to the surface took 3 hours. Nobody spoke. The miner's body stayed in the cave, too deep to retrieve. They'd lost one life and gained nothing except proof that some roots were paid for in blood. They emerged into twilight, the forest painted in shades of purple and gold. Kaelin was waiting at the cave mouth, flanked by wolves whose eyes reflected the dying light. His gaze went immediately to Sable, taking in the torn clothes and the blood and the way she was holding her ribs. What happened? Astrid gave a terse report. The cave creature, the lost miner, the root's instability. Kaelin listened without interruption. When she finished, he looked at Sable. "You saved Sarah." I reacted. "That's all. You put yourself between a civilian and a threat." He stepped closer, and she could see something shifting in his expression. That's not reaction, that's choice. She was too tired to argue. The adrenaline was wearing off, and her ribs were screaming, and all she wanted was to sit down and not think about underwater monsters or trade agreements or empires balanced on the edge of collapse. Kaelin turned to Astrid. "Get her to the healers. Full examination. I'm fine." That wasn't a suggestion. His voice carried the weight of command. Then he looked at the rest of the team. "You all did well. The route didn't work. But you gathered intelligence we didn't have. That has value." "We lost Marcus," Sarah said quietly. "I know. And tomorrow I'll visit his family. I'll tell them he died serving Stormfall, that his sacrifice mattered." His jaw tightened. "But tonight, I need you all to rest." The team dispersed toward the fortress, exhaustion written in every step. Sable started to follow, but Kaelin caught her arm. "Wait." She stopped, too tired to resist. He studied her in the fading light, and she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before, something that might have been recognition. "You didn't hesitate," he said quietly. "When the creature came for Sarah, you didn't calculate risk or weigh options. You just moved. It was instinct. No, it was leadership." He released her arm. Most people freeze when confronted with that kind of threat. They wait for someone else to act. You didn't. I've made a career out of not freezing. This was different. He gestured toward the cave mouth. "Down there, you became exactly what I've been trying to build in this empire. Someone who acts on conviction instead of calculation. Someone who risks themselves to protect others. I'm not a leader. I'm just a cartographer who's bad at staying neutral. You're whatever you choose to be." His voice softened fractionally. "And right now, you're choosing to be someone this empire needs." Before she could respond, he turned and walked back toward the fortress, wolves trailing in his wake. Sable stood alone in the gathering dark, the pendant around her neck suddenly heavier, and realized with a cold clarity that she'd crossed a threshold she couldn't retreat from. She wasn't a cartographer anymore. She was something else. Something dangerous. And somewhere in the fortress behind her, Counselor Brennan was sharpening his knives and planning her execution. The healer's chamber smelled like dried herbs and something sharper, alcohol maybe, or the kind of antiseptic that burned going in. Sable sat on a wooden bench while a woman with silver-streaked hair probed the gash across her ribs with fingers that had forgotten gentleness somewhere in the last 1,000 patients. "This needs stitches." "I figured." The healer didn't look up. "You're lucky it didn't go deeper. Another inch and we'd be discussing organ damage instead of cosmetic scarring." Sable winced as the needle pierced skin. "How many people have you patched up from cave expeditions gone wrong?" "Fewer than you'd think. Most people who go into unmapped caves don't come back out." The healer pulled the thread taut. You must have impressed someone to get royal protection. That pendant around your neck isn't handed out to cartographers who know their place. I don't know my place. That's the problem. The healer's hands paused fractionally. Then you and the king have something in common. She finished the stitches in silence, wrapping Sable's torso in clean bandages that smelled faintly of pine. When she was done, she stepped back and studied her work with the critical eye of someone who measured success in survival rates. Stay dry for 3 days. Don't lift anything heavier than a water skin. And if you feel fever coming on, you come straight back here. Cave creatures carry infections that'll kill you faster than their teeth. Noted. Sable left the healing wing and found Astrid waiting in the corridor, arms crossed, expression unreadable. You should be resting. I've rested enough. It's been 2 hours. Astrid fell into step beside her. You went underground, fought a creature the size of a supply wagon, and got stitched back together. That's not the kind of day you just walk off. What do you want me to do? Lie in bed and pretend I'm not a political target with an execution order hanging over my head? Fair point. They walked in silence through corridors that were starting to feel familiar. The turn toward the Great Hall, the passage to the armory, the stairs that led to the battlements, where you could see the forest stretching to the horizon like a dark sea. Sable had spent a decade mapping territories, and she'd never stayed in one place long enough to memorize its internal geography. Now she was learning Blackwater Keep the way you learn survival routes in hostile terrain, because that's what it was. Hostile terrain where every conversation was a negotiation and every silence carried threat. Astrid stopped at a heavy oak door carved with wolves mid-hunt. The war room. Kaelin wants to see you, now. 5 minutes ago, actually, but I figured you needed medical attention more than you needed a strategic briefing. Sable touched the bandages under her shirt, feeling the pull of fresh stitches. What's the briefing about? Brennan called an emergency council session. He's moving faster than we anticipated. How much faster? The session starts in 20 minutes. Astrid's expression was grim. He's demanding immediate execution. No trial, no deliberation, just enforcement of trade law. Can he do that? Technically, no. But if he gets enough council support, he can force Kaelin's hand, make it a choice between you and political stability. So I'm leverage. You've always been leverage. Astrid pushed open the door. The question is whether you're worth what Kaelin's about to sacrifice to keep you breathing. The war room was smaller than the council chamber, but somehow more intimidating. A single table dominated the space, covered in maps and reports and weapons that looked like they'd been used recently. Kaelin stood at the far end, one hand braced on the table, staring at a map of Stormfall's borders with the intensity of a man trying to see past the ink into the future. He didn't look up when they entered. Tell me the cave route is viable. It's not. Sable moved to the opposite side of the table. The main chamber floods. There's a creature, possibly multiple creatures, that have adapted to hunt in complete darkness. And the passages are too unstable for regular transport. So we're back to renegotiating with people who want us dead. Or finding a third option we haven't thought of yet. He looked up, and the exhaustion in his eyes was absolute. There is no third option. That's what you haven't learned yet. Power is binary. You either have enough to dictate terms, or you don't. Everything else is just negotiation over the price of surrender. That's bleak. That's governance. He straightened, rolling his shoulders like a fighter loosening up before a bout. Brennan's calling for your execution in 20 minutes. He has the votes. 4 counselors are confirmed in his camp. 2 more are leaning his direction. How many votes does he need? 7 out of 12 for emergency enforcement. If he gets them, I can refuse to carry out the order. But that refusal fractures the council. Half of them walk. The Empire loses cohesion at exactly the moment our enemies are watching for weakness. So you let me die and keep your empire intact. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Kaelin walked around the table with the slow deliberation of a man making calculations he didn't want to make. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Dangerous. If I thought letting you die would save this empire, I'd hand you to Brennan myself. But it won't, because the empire I'd be saving isn't worth the stone it's built on. Pretty words don't stop executioners. No. But declarations do. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the scar at his temple that looked like it had come from a blade. I'm going to make you an official advisor. royal appointment. It puts you under permanent protection and gives you legal standing to attend council sessions. Brennan will lose his mind. Brennan's already lost his mind. This just makes it official. He pulled a document from his coat, unfolding it on the table. It was already written, ink still wet, bearing the royal seal. Sign here. Sable stared at the paper. A royal advisor position. It meant authority, resources, protection. It also meant she was no longer an outsider observing the system. She was inside it, part of it, complicit in ways she couldn't undo. Understanding the weight of that choice is what separates leaders from martyrs. Kaylin's voice was soft. Martyrs die for principles. Leaders live with compromise and try to make it mean something. What if I don't want to be a leader? Then you shouldn't have cut those chains. The words hit like a physical blow because they were true. She'd acted on instinct 3 days ago and set in motion a cascade she couldn't control. The children she'd freed were alive because she'd refused to calculate cost. But that same refusal had dragged her into a war between factions she barely understood, made her a symbol for something larger than herself. Power abhors a vacuum. That's what her father had told her once, back when he was still teaching her cartography instead of drinking himself to death in port cities that all looked the same. When you create space, something rushes in to fill it. The only choice is whether you control what fills it or let someone else decide for you. She picked up the quill. The ink was black and heavy. Her signature came out shaky but legible. Sable Crestmore. The surname felt strange. She hadn't used it in years, had let it fall away with the rest of her past. But official documents required official names. Kaylin took the paper, folding it with precise movements. Now you're a weapon I can use. Whether that's a gift or a curse depends on whether you survive the next hour. Inspiring. I'm not here to inspire you. I'm here to keep you alive long enough to be useful. Astrid cleared her throat. We should move. Council convenes in 15 minutes, and Brennan will want time to position his supporters before we arrive. They left the war room, and Sable caught her reflection in a polished shield hanging on the corridor wall. The woman staring back looked harder than the cartographer who'd cut chains 3 days ago. Something in the eyes had changed, sharpened. She wondered if that's what happened to everyone who stepped into Kaylin's orbit. If proximity to that kind of power either broke you or forged you into something harder, something capable of surviving in a world where every conversation was combat and every decision left bodies in its wake. The council chamber was already full when they arrived. Brennan sat in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who'd counted votes and liked the numbers. The 4 counselors in his camp were clustered together on the left side of the semicircle. 2 older men who looked like career bureaucrats, a woman with military bearing, and a younger man whose eyes tracked Sable like she was prey. Counselor Marin sat alone on the right, silver hair catching torchlight, expression neutral. The remaining counselors occupied the middle ground, faces carefully blank. Kaylin took his elevated seat, and the room went silent. Brennan stood immediately. I call this emergency session to order. The matter before us is simple. The woman who violated trade law 3 days ago remains unpunished. This creates dangerous precedent and signals weakness to our enemies. We've been through this. Marin's voice was dry. You lost the vote yesterday. Yesterday's vote was premature. We hadn't yet established the full scope of her crimes. Brennan pulled a document from his robes. I've compiled a list. Interference with legal commerce, destruction of private property, assault on licensed merchants. And now, he looked directly at Sable, incitement of cave exploration that resulted in the death of Marcus Flint, a 17-year veteran miner. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Sable felt her chest tighten. Marcus had died because a creature attacked, not because of her survey plan. But truth and narrative were different things, and Brennan was weaponizing the difference. That's a reach even for you, Astrid's voice cut through the chamber. The cave expedition was approved by the king. If you want to assign blame for Marcus's death, you'll need to go through royal authority first. I'm not assigning blame. I'm establishing pattern. Brennan gestured toward Sable. This woman disrupts everything she touches. She interferes with trade, undermines legal frameworks, and now gets our people killed pursuing impossible alternatives. How many more bodies before we acknowledge the obvious? Which is, she's dangerous. Not because she's malicious, because she's incompetent. She acts on emotion instead of strategy. She substitutes moral conviction for practical understanding, and she's infected the king with the same disease. Careful, counselor. Kaylin's voice was soft, but it carried warning. Brennan either didn't hear it or didn't care. You voided the Varn agreement on impulse. You've destabilized our trade framework. You're pursuing cave routes that any competent strategist would have identified as non-viable from the start, all because this woman made you feel something. The chamber went absolutely still. Kaylin rose slowly and the temperature seemed to drop. Say that again? You're making decisions based on sentiment instead of strategy. Brennan's voice rose. Your father built this empire on ruthless pragmatism. He understood that empires don't run on feelings. They run on fear and force and the willingness to make hard choices. You're throwing that away because a cartographer with a savior complex made you remember what guilt feels like. My father, Kaylin's voice was ice, built an empire that required child trafficking to maintain trade relationships, that measured success in bodies and called it stability, that turned brutality into policy and expected everyone to pretend it was strength. It was strength. Brennan slammed his hand on the armrest. It kept us alive, kept our borders secure, kept our people fed. Everything you're dismantling now was purchased with his blood and sacrifice. And look what it cost him. Kaylin descended the steps toward Brennan with the deliberate pace of a predator. It hollowed him out, made him cruel, made him into something that couldn't remember why empires exist in the first place. Empires exist to survive. No, they exist to protect the people inside them. Survival without purpose is just postponing death. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Brennan turned to address the other counselors. He's philosophizing when he should be strategizing. He's prioritizing individual conscience over collective security. And this woman, he pointed at Sable, is the catalyst. Then I'll make her something more than a catalyst. Kaylin pulled the folded document from his coat, holding it up. As of 10 minutes ago, Sable Crestmore is a royal advisor with full council privileges. The chamber erupted. Counselors on their feet, voices overlapping, Brennan's face going purple with rage. Marin was the only one who remained seated, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. You can't do this, Brennan's voice cut through the chaos. Royal appointments require council approval. Royal appointments require council approval during peacetime. Kaylin's voice was flat. We're not at peace. We're on the edge of trade war, possible military conflict, and internal political fracture. That gives me emergency appointment authority. That authority is for military positions. It's for any position I deem necessary for empire security. And I deem this necessary because she makes you feel things. Brennan's voice dripped contempt. This isn't strategy. This is obsession. The word landed like a thrown blade. Kaylin went very still and Sable saw something shift in his expression, something dangerous. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that everyone had to strain to hear it. You want to talk about obsession? Fine. Let's talk about yours. Your obsession with maintaining systems that were broken from the start. Your obsession with calling brutality pragmatism and pretending that makes it acceptable. Your obsession with power that serves itself instead of the people it's supposed to protect. I'm trying to save this empire. You're trying to save your position in it. There's a difference. Brennan's hand went to the knife at his belt, just a fraction of movement, barely visible, but Astrid saw it. She was across the chamber in 3 strides, blade drawn, positioning herself between Brennan and Kaylin. Don't. Her voice was surgical. Whatever you're thinking, don't. Brennan's hand dropped, but his expression promised violence. This isn't over. No, it's not. Kaylin gestured toward Sable. Royal Advisor Crestmore will attend all future council sessions. She'll have full access to trade documents, strategic planning, and border intelligence. Any counselor who obstructs her work obstructs the crown. You're making a mistake. I'm making a choice. And unlike you, I'm willing to live with the consequences. He turned and walked out of the chamber, Astrid at his shoulder. Sable stood frozen for a moment, acutely aware that every counselor was staring at her, some with curiosity, some with calculation. Brennan with pure hatred. Marin rose gracefully, moving to Sable's side. Walk with me, child, before someone does something regrettable. They left the chamber together, Brennan's gaze burning into Sable's back like a brand. The corridor outside was empty, torches casting long shadows. Marin didn't speak until they'd put 3 turns between themselves and the council chamber. You just became the most dangerous person in Stormfall. I thought I already was. Before you were a disruption, an outsider causing problems. Now you're internal, part of the structure. That makes you a target in ways you don't yet understand. Marin stopped at a window overlooking the courtyard where soldiers drilled in formation. External enemies you can see coming. Internal ones hide behind polite conversation and wait for the perfect moment to strike. You're talking about Brennan. I'm talking about everyone. Marin's gaze was steady. The council is fractured. Half of them see you as Kaelin's conscience made flesh. The other half sees you as his weakness. Both sides will try to use you. The question is whether you're strong enough to avoid being used by either. I didn't ask for this. No one asks for power. It's thrust upon you, and then you either wield it or it wields you. Marin turned from the window. I'm going to tell you something the king won't because he's too close to see it clearly. What? He's not protecting you because you freed those children. He's protecting you because when he watches you act, he sees the person he used to be before the crown broke him. You remind him that conviction without calculation is possible, that instinct isn't always weakness, and that terrifies him more than any external threat. Why would that terrify him? Because if instinct is valid, then every calculated brutality he's committed in the name of empire security becomes a choice instead of a necessity. And men like Kaelin can't afford to question their choices. The weight would crush them. Sable felt something cold settle in her chest. So I'm what? A mirror he doesn't want to look into. You're a mirror he can't stop looking into. And mirrors are dangerous things in palaces built on compromise. Marin left her there with the weight of that truth and the sound of soldiers drilling and the knowledge that she'd just been promoted into a position where every breath was political and every word could start wars. She made her way back to her quarters through corridors that felt different now. Before, she'd been a guest, temporary, transient. Now she had official status, a role, responsibilities she didn't understand to people she barely knew in an empire that was tearing itself apart. The room was dark when she entered, only starlight through the window providing illumination. She moved to light a candle and froze. Someone was sitting in the chair by the window. Kaelin's voice came from the shadows. We need to talk. Her hand found the knife at her belt before she could stop herself. You could have announced yourself instead of lurking in the dark like an assassin. Assassins don't announce themselves. That's the point. He leaned forward and candlelight caught his face, throwing sharp shadows across his features. Besides, I needed to see if you'd react with violence or fear. And violence. Good. Fear gets you killed in Stormfall. She lit the candle properly, flooding the room with warm light. What do you want? To make sure you understand what you signed up for. He stood, moving to the window. Royal Advisor isn't just a title. It's a target. Every enemy I have will come for you now. Not directly. That would be too obvious, but through politics and manipulation and carefully orchestrated accidents. Astrid already gave me the speech. Astrid doesn't know the full scope. He turned to face her. I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone. 3 years ago, I had someone I trusted. Someone who reminded me that power could serve purpose instead of just perpetuating itself. Her name was Lyra, and she was brilliant, and she saw systems the way you see geography. What happened to her? Brennan happened. He couldn't remove her directly, so he manufactured scandal, made it look like she was selling military intelligence to the Frostmark clans. I knew it was fabricated, but the evidence was convincing enough that I couldn't ignore it without looking weak. So I exiled her. Sable's throat went tight. Did she survive? I don't know. She disappeared into Frostmark territory, and I never heard from her again. He looked out the window at the dark forest. Every day since then, I've wondered if I could have protected her better, if I could have found a way to keep both her and the Empire intact. Why are you telling me this? Because I won't make the same mistake twice. Whatever Brennan throws at you, I'll counter it. Whatever scandal he manufactures, I'll dismantle it. I won't let political maneuvering take another person who makes me remember what this crown is supposed to mean. The vulnerability in his admission made something shift in her chest. This wasn't the Alpha King. This wasn't the ruler who commanded wolves and bent men to his will. This was just a person carrying weight he'd never asked for and trying desperately not to be crushed by it. She moved closer, close enough to see the exhaustion etched into his features. You can't protect everyone. I can protect you. Why? Because you're the first person in 3 years who's made me question whether the compromises I've made are actually necessary or just convenient. Because when I watch you act on conviction, I remember what it felt like to believe that right and wrong were simple choices instead of gradients I have to navigate blind. Because he stopped, jaw tightening. Because what? Because I'm tired of being alone in this. His voice was rough. Every decision I make affects thousands of lives. Every compromise leaves bodies behind. And I do it all alone because that's what kingship requires. But when you cut those chains, when you threw yourself between Sarah and that creature, when you signed that document knowing it made you a target, you became someone who shares the weight. And I need that. Need you. Even if it's selfish. Even if it puts you in danger. The admission hung between them like something fragile. Sable reached up and touched his face, fingers tracing the scar at his temple. How did you get this? My father. During a disagreement about trade policy when I was 16, he wanted to expand the trafficking agreements. I refused. He reminded me that refusal wasn't an option for heirs. So you learned to compromise. I learned to survive. He closed his eyes briefly. And somewhere in the process of surviving, I forgot why survival mattered in the first place. She let her hand drop, but didn't step back. I'm not Lyra. I know. I'm not going to make you feel better about the choices you've made. I'm not going to soften the edges or tell you the compromises were worth it. I don't want you to. Then what do you want from me? The truth. Even when it's brutal. Even when it makes me question everything. He opened his eyes, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. I need someone who won't let me hide behind necessary evils, who will force me to acknowledge when pragmatism becomes cruelty. That's a lot of weight to put on someone you just met. I know. But I'm putting it there anyway because the alternative is becoming my father, and I'd rather die. The rawness of it cut through every defense she had. This was a man who'd built walls so high he'd forgotten what daylight looked like, and he was asking her to help him tear them down. It was terrifying and overwhelming, and she had no idea if she was strong enough to carry that kind of responsibility. But she'd cut the chains anyway, had thrown herself at the creature anyway, had signed the document anyway. Because when had she ever calculated cost before acting? I'll tell you the truth. Her voice was steady. But you have to promise not to hide behind royal authority when you don't like what you hear. Deal. And you have to actually listen, not just tolerate my presence. Actually consider that I might be right, even when it contradicts everything you've built. That's harder. I know. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he held out his hand, formal and strange. Partners in dismantling empires and hopefully not dying in the process. She took it. His grip was warm, calloused, the hand of someone who'd held swords and signed death warrants and carried weight that would have broken most people. Partners. The moment stretched, neither of them moving, the handshake becoming something more than professional courtesy, becoming acknowledgement, recognition, the kind of connection that forms between people who've looked into the same abyss and decided to jump anyway. Kaylin released her hand first, stepping back. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start renegotiating trade agreements, and you'll need to be sharp. Where are you going? To make sure Brennan doesn't try anything tonight. He moved toward the door, then paused. Sable. Lock this door after I leave, and keep that knife close, planning to protect me from assassins, planning to make sure you can protect yourself. He left, and she did as instructed, sliding the heavy bolt home and checking the window latches. The knife went under her pillow, close enough to grab, but not so close she'd accidentally stab herself if she rolled over. She lay in the dark, listening to the fortress settle around her. Footsteps in distant corridors. Guards changing watch. Wolves howling somewhere in the forest beyond the walls. All of it foreign and familiar at once. Sleep should have been impossible, but exhaustion pulled her under within minutes. She dreamed of caves and creatures and chains that multiplied every time she cut them. Dreamed of Kaylin's scar and her father's disappointed face and 7 children scattered in darkness, reaching for hands that weren't there. She woke to pounding on the door. Dawn light filtered through the window, gray and cold. The pounding continued, urgent and rhythmic. Sable grabbed the knife and moved to the door. Who is it? Astrid, open up. She slid the bolt back and Astrid pushed inside, face grim. We have a problem. It's barely dawn. Can't problems wait until after breakfast? Not this one. Astrid moved to the window, scanning the courtyard below. One of the children you freed, Tam, he's missing. Sable's chest went tight. Missing how? He was in the East Barracks last night with Kira and the others. This morning, his bed was empty. No signs of struggle. No indication of where he went. He's 8 years old. He can't have gotten far. Unless someone took him. The implication settled like lead. Brennan. We don't have proof, but the timing is convenient. Council session yesterday, Tam disappears last night. If Brennan wanted to send a message about the cost of your interference, he'd use a child as leverage. Astrid's expression confirmed it. Kalen's already mobilized search teams. But if Brennan has him, finding him won't be enough. We'll need proof of abduction, and proof is hard to manufacture when your enemy controls half the council. Sable's mind raced through options, all of them ending in violence or political suicide. Where would Brennan keep him? If he's smart, nowhere on fortress grounds. Too easy to search. But he has connections outside the walls, safe houses, allies who'd hide a child for the right price. Then we search outside. With what authority? Astrid's voice was flat. You're a royal advisor, but your jurisdiction ends at the fortress walls. Brennan knows that. He's probably counting on it. Sable grabbed her coat, checking that the knife was secure at her belt. Then I'll go without authority. That's suicide. That's a child who trusted me to keep him safe. She met Astrid's gaze. I'm not letting Brennan use him as a political pawn. Astrid studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. I'm coming with you. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Because if you get yourself killed, Kalen will tear the Empire apart looking for whoever did it. And I'd rather prevent that scenario than clean up after it. They left through a side gate, avoiding the main courtyard where Kalen's search teams were assembling. The forest beyond the walls was dense, morning mist turning the trees into ghosts. Astrid moved with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent years operating in hostile territory. Where are we going? Brennan has a hunting lodge about 3 miles northeast, remote, defensible, the kind of place you'd keep something you didn't want found. How do you know he has a hunting lodge? Because I've used it myself for operations that required discretion. Astrid's voice was matter-of-fact. Welcome to palace politics. Everyone has secrets. The only question is whose secrets get weaponized first. They moved through the forest in silence, Astrid navigating by instinct and Sable following close. The mist was starting to burn off, sunlight filtering through the canopy in thin shafts that turned the ground into a patchwork of shadow and light. An hour in, Astrid stopped abruptly. Hand signal? Danger. Sable froze, listening. Voices ahead, low and deliberate. Someone giving orders. They crept forward until the lodge came into view through the trees. Small structure, stone and timber, smoke rising from the chimney. 2 guards outside, armed with crossbows. And in the window, a flash of movement. Small, child-sized. Tam. Astrid pulled Sable back into the tree line. 2 guards outside. Probably more inside. If we go in loud, they'll kill him before we get through the door, so we go in quiet. You know how to fight. I know how to cut chains and stab underwater monsters. That's about it. Astrid's smile was sharp. Good enough. She pulled a small vial from her pack, uncorking it carefully. Sedative. Fast acting. If we can get it into their water supply, we won't have to fight our way through. How do we get to their water supply? Sable studied the lodge, mapping its structure the way she'd mapped terrain. Stone foundation, timber walls, thatched roof, and at the back, a well. There. She pointed. If we contaminate the well, they'll drink it within hours. Hours is too long. Tam could be moved by then. Then we create urgency. Make them thirsty. How? Sable looked at the forest around them. Dense undergrowth, dry leaves despite the morning mist. Everything perfectly combustible if you knew how to start a fire that spread fast but burned out before it became uncontrollable. We smoke them out. Small fire upwind, enough to make the lodge uncomfortable but not enough to burn it down. They'll drink water to deal with the smoke inhalation. We dose the well first. Astrid stared at her. That's actually not terrible. I have my moments. They work quickly. Astrid dosing the well while Sable gathered kindling and positioned it upwind of the lodge. The fire started small, almost innocent, then caught properly and began producing thick white smoke that the wind carried directly toward the building. Within minutes, one of the guards was coughing, then the other. The door opened and a third man emerged, face red, eyes watering. He barked something at the guards and they all moved to the well, hauling up water and drinking deeply. Astrid counted under her breath. 30 seconds. 45. 1 minute. The first guard swayed, then sat down heavily. The second followed within seconds. The third made it back to the doorway before his legs gave out. Now. They moved fast, Astrid going through the front door while Sable circled to the back. The interior was dim, smoke-filled. 3 more men slumped in chairs around a table. And in the corner, tied to a support beam, Tam. His eyes went wide when he saw her. She put a finger to her lips, moving quickly to cut his bonds with the knife Astrid had given her. The rope parted and he collapsed into her arms, trembling. You came. Always. She hoisted him up, trying to ignore the way her stitches pulled. Can you walk? He nodded, tears streaming down his face. Astrid appeared from the main room, wiping blood from her knife. 2 more in the back. Sedated. We need to move before someone wakes up or reinforcements arrive. They left through the back door, Tam between them, moving as fast as his small legs could manage. The smoke was already dissipating, the fire burning itself out just as Sable had planned. No permanent damage, no bodies. Just an empty lodge and unconscious guards who'd wake up with splitting headaches and no child to show for their trouble. They made it half a mile before they heard pursuit. Shouts behind them, multiple voices, at least 4, maybe more. Astrid swore. They had backup nearby. She looked at Sable. Can you run? Sable's ribs screamed protest, but she nodded. Let's find out. They ran. The forest became a blur of green and brown, branches whipping past, roots trying to trip them. Tam kept pace somehow, terror lending him speed. But the voices behind them were getting closer. Professional pursuit, coordinated. Astrid pulled them off the main path into denser undergrowth. Through here. There's a ravine ahead. If we can reach it. The crossbow bolt took her in the shoulder. She went down hard, biting back a scream. Sable grabbed Tam and dragged them both behind a fallen tree as more bolts thudded into wood. 4 men emerged from the trees, reloading with practiced efficiency. Brennan's voice carried through the forest. Royal Advisor Cressmore. I'm impressed. I didn't think you had it in you to mount a rescue operation. Too bad it ends here. He stepped into view, flanked by 2 more guards. Clean clothes, polished boots, the kind of appearance that required preparation. He'd known they'd come. Had been waiting. Sable's mind raced through options. Astrid was bleeding, probably couldn't fight. Tam was terrified, couldn't run. And she was one woman with a knife against 6 armed guards and a counselor who'd just cornered his prey. There was no way out. Brennan smiled like he could read her thoughts. You should have stayed neutral, cartographer. Maps don't bleed, systems don't care about your conscience, and children make terrible leverage unless you're willing to watch them die. He gestured, and one of the guards raised his crossbow, aiming directly at Tam. Sable put herself between them, arms spread. You want to send a message to Kaelin? Fine. Send it through me. But the boy goes free, touching. Brennan's voice dripped mockery. But ineffective. The message requires his body. Yours is just a bonus. The guard's finger tightened on the trigger, and then the forest exploded with wolves. They came from 3 directions at once, massive bodies slamming into guards with bone-breaking force. Brennan's men went down screaming, crossbows clattering away. And through the chaos, moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd stopped fighting his nature years ago. Kaelin. He was on Brennan before the counselor could draw his blade, one hand locked around his throat, lifting him off the ground like he weighed nothing. The wolves circled, snarling, waiting for the command to finish it. Kaelin's voice was soft. Lethal. You took something that belongs under my protection. Brennan's face was turning purple, but he managed to choke out words. Proving a point. She's dangerous, getting people killed, making you weak, making me remember what strength actually means. Kaelin's grip tightened. You're right about one thing. I have been weak, too concerned with maintaining systems instead of questioning whether those systems deserve to survive. But that ends now. He threw Brennan to the ground and the wolves moved closer, growling. You can't kill me. Brennan's voice was strangled. The council will fracture. The empire will collapse. Then it collapses. Kaelin crouched down, eye level. Because I'm done building on foundations that require me to become my father. I'm done calling brutality pragmatic, and I'm done tolerating people who use children as weapons. He stood, and something in his posture had changed, shifted, like a decision had been made that couldn't be unmade. Counselor Brennan, as of this moment, you're stripped of rank and title. You have 48 hours to leave Stormfall territory. If you're found within our borders after that, the wolves will have you. The guards who could still move were already running. Brennan staggered to his feet, face twisted with rage and disbelief. This is political suicide. Half the council will walk. Let them. The empire will fracture. Then we'll rebuild it better. You're a fool. Maybe. Kalen's voice was cold. But I'm a fool with wolves and a kingdom and absolutely nothing left to lose. Get out of my sight before I change my mind about the 48 hours. Brennan fled into the forest, stumbling and cursing. His remaining guards followed, leaving equipment and dignity scattered behind them. Kalen turned to Sable, and the hardness in his expression cracked fractionally. You're bleeding. She looked down, blood soaking through her shirt where the stitches had torn. So is Astrid. He moved to the commander first, examining her shoulder with practiced efficiency. Clean through, missed the bone. You'll live. Always do. Astrid's voice was tight with pain. One of the wolves moved close to Tam, who'd been frozen in shock. Instead of fear, the boy reached out tentatively, touching its fur. The wolf, a massive gray beast that could have swallowed him whole, lowered its head and let him pet it. Kalen looked at Sable, and something passed between them. Understanding, recognition, the knowledge that they'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He'd exiled a counselor, had threatened death, had chosen her and Tam and Astrid over political stability, had made the empire conditional on conscience instead of compromise. It was the point of no return, and they were both standing on the far side of it now, watching the old world burn and hoping the new one they built from the ashes would be worth what it cost. The fortress felt different when they returned. Smaller somehow, like the walls had contracted while they were gone. Or maybe it was just that everything looked fragile now that Kalen had made his choice visible, burned his bridges, exiled a counselor, and dared the rest to follow. Sable walked through the gates with Tam's hand in hers, Astrid being half carried by two soldiers, and Kalen moving ahead with the kind of controlled fury that made people step aside without being told. The wolves ranged around them like an honor guard, and whispers followed in their wake. Did you hear? Brennan's exiled. The king chose the cartographer over the council. Half the government's about to walk. We're headed for civil war. The whispers weren't wrong. By the time they reached the Great Hall, 5 counselors were already waiting. Not the full 12, just 5. The ones who'd backed Brennan, plus one Sable, didn't recognize. A thin man with the calculating eyes of someone who'd survived by knowing when to switch sides. Counselor Marin stood off to the side, observing. Not participating, just watching the empire fracture with the detached interest of someone who'd seen it happen before. The thin man stepped forward. His name was Voss, Sable remembered. Trade minister. The kind of bureaucrat who measured everything in gold and nothing in lives. My lord, his voice was carefully neutral. We need to discuss the Brennan situation. There's nothing to discuss. Kalen's voice was flat. He kidnapped a child under royal protection. He's exiled. It's done. The child was leverage in a political dispute. Voss's expression didn't change. Harsh, certainly, but not without precedent. Counselor Brennan was attempting to demonstrate the consequences of your recent policy shifts by threatening an 8-year-old, by making the abstract concrete. Voss gestured toward the maps on the wall. You've voided trade agreements, destabilized our economic framework, appointed an outsider with no governance experience to a senior advisory position. These actions have consequences that extend beyond moral abstractions. I'm aware of the consequences. Are you? Because from where we're standing, it looks like you're dismantling the empire your father built, because a woman who cuts chains made you feel guilty about the compromises necessary to maintain it. The accusation hung in the air. Not quite Brennan's rage, worse somehow, colder, more calculated. The kind of argument that wore down resistance through logic instead of emotion. Kalen's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. My father built an empire on brutality and called it strength. I'm trying to build something that doesn't require child trafficking to maintain trade relationships. Noble. Voss's smile was surgical, also economically suicidal. The Varn agreement provided 30% of our southern food imports. The cave routes proved non-viable. You've eliminated our supply chain without securing alternatives. In 6 months, we'll have starvation in the outer territories. Then we have 6 months to find solutions. Or, Voss glanced at the other 4 counselors, who nodded fractionally. We restore the Varn agreement, reinstate Brennan, and acknowledge that this entire experiment in conscience-based governance was a mistake. No. The word came out harder than Sable had heard from him. Not negotiable, not open to debate, just flat refusal that carried the weight of royal authority. Voss's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Then, as of this moment, we resign our positions. All 5 of us. Effective immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. Kaelin studied each of them in turn, reading calculations and loyalties and the cold mathematics of people who'd decided their survival lay elsewhere. You're fracturing the government over this. You fractured it when you chose sentiment over strategy. Voss pulled a folded document from his robes, placing it on the table. Our formal resignations, countersigned by the other counselors who'll be following suit within the hour. How many? 3 more. Voss's voice was matter-of-fact. That leaves you with 4 counselors out of 12. Not enough to maintain quorum for any significant legislation. Not enough to ratify trade agreements or military deployments. You'll be ruling by emergency decree, which will signal weakness to every enemy we have. Then I'll rule by emergency decree. For how long? Voss leaned forward. A month. A year. Until the Frostmark clans decide you're vulnerable and push south. Until House Varn unites the other merchant houses against you. Until your own military commanders realize they're taking orders from a king who governs alone because he couldn't maintain his own council. I didn't drive you out. You're choosing to leave because you've made it impossible to stay. Voss's voice hardened. You appointed an outsider who knows nothing about governance. You exiled a counselor for doing what he thought necessary to protect the empire. You're dismantling systems that have kept us alive for 3 generations. Staying would make us complicit in the collapse. Then go. Kaelin's voice was quiet, but it cut like a blade. Get out of my fortress. Take your calculations and your careful neutrality and find somewhere else to practice your mathematics of atrocity. Voss inclined his head fractionally. As you wish, my lord. But when this falls apart, and it will, remember that we warned you. He turned and walked out, the other 4 following. Their footsteps echoed in the hall long after they'd disappeared. Marin moved from the shadows, her expression unreadable. Well, that was dramatic. How many more? Kaelin's voice was tired. 2, maybe 3. She moved to the table where Voss had left the resignation documents. The military commanders will stay. They follow you, not the council. Same with Astrid's security forces. But the bureaucrats, the trade ministers, the ones who measure power in gold, they'll walk. Let them. You'll be governing with 4 counselors. That's not a government. That's a dictatorship with a council-shaped decoration. Then that's what it is. He looked at Sable, and something in his expression made her chest tighten. I'm done pretending that compromise with people who traffic children is anything but cowardice wearing a pragmatic mask. Marin studied him for a long moment. Your father said something similar once, right before he started executing anyone who disagreed with him. Be careful, the crusade doesn't consume you the way it consumed him. I'm not my father. No. You're worse. She moved toward the door, then paused. He at least had the excuse of ignorance. You know exactly what you're doing, and you're doing it anyway. That makes you either very brave or very dangerous. Possibly both. She left them alone in the great hall, Sable and Kaelin, and the weight of choices that were starting to feel less like liberation and more like slow-motion collapse. Sable broke the silence first. How long do we have? Before what? Before the Empire tears itself apart. He walked to the map wall, one hand tracing borders that suddenly looked more fragile than she'd realized. Weeks. Maybe months if we're lucky. The outer territories will test our authority first. Small rebellions, withheld taxes. When we can't respond effectively because we don't have enough counselors to authorize military deployment, the Frostmark clans will move. House Varn will rally the merchant coalition, and somewhere in the chaos, someone will decide I'm vulnerable enough to remove. So we shore up support. Find new counselors. People who share your vision. There are no people who share my vision. His voice was flat. You don't understand. The council members who just walked, they weren't monsters. They were pragmatists who looked at impossible situations and made the least terrible choices available. The ones who stay aren't better. They're just more loyal or more afraid. Then what do? We adapt. He turned from the map. The council structure was designed for stable governance during peacetime. We're not at peace. We're in the opening stages of a political war that will determine whether Stormfall survives the next year. So we abandon the council model and move to something more flexible. A dictatorship. A command structure that can respond to threats without requiring consensus from people who've already abandoned ship. That's still a dictatorship. Yes, his gaze was steady. It is. And that should terrify you. Because dictatorships require someone willing to make every decision alone, and I'm not sure I'm strong enough to do that without becoming exactly what I'm trying to dismantle. The admission hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Then don't do it alone. Sable moved closer. You said you needed someone to share the weight, so let me. Stop treating me like a symbol and start treating me like a partner. You don't have experience? I have clarity, which is what you said you valued. She gestured toward the maps. You understand strategy and power structures and political maneuvering. I understand systems and pressure points and how geography shapes conflict. Combine them. And when we disagree, then we argue until one of us concedes or we find a third option. But we do it together instead of you carrying everything alone and wondering why it's crushing you. He studied her with that same intensity she'd seen in the forest. Calculating. Weighing. Looking for weakness or deception and finding neither. All right. His voice was quiet. Partners. But if this goes wrong, if we make decisions that get people killed, we live with it. She cut him off. Same as you've been doing for years. Except now there are two of us carrying the weight instead of one. Something in his expression eased fractionally. Not quite relief. But maybe it's foundation. The door slammed open and Astrid stumbled in, shoulder bandaged but eyes sharp. We have a problem. Kalen's hand went to the blade at his belt. What kind? The kind where 3 more counselors just resigned and rode out the north gate. That leaves you with Marin and 2 junior advisors who barely have authority to order supplies, much less govern territories. 3 weeks. Sable's voice was hollow. You said we had weeks. It's been 3 hours and half the government is gone. Because word travels fast when empires fracture. Astrid moved to the table, pulling a report from her coat. I've got intelligence from the border outpost. The Frostmark clans are mobilizing. Nothing overt yet. Just troop movements that could be routine exercises or could be preparation for southern expansion. How long until we know which? Days. Maybe less. She looked at Kalen directly. You need to make a decision. Either we militarize immediately and hope we can hold the borders with reduced bureaucratic support, or we attempt reconciliation with the resigned counselors before this becomes irreversible. No reconciliation. Kalen's voice was hard. They walked when I needed them. They chose their version of stability over the possibility of something better. I won't beg them to come back. Then we militarize. Astrid's expression was grim, which means emergency conscription, reallocating resources from civilian infrastructure to military readiness. Essentially, everything your father did that you've been trying to undo. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Do it. Kalen's jaw tightened, but with one difference. We're transparent about why. No hidden conscriptions, no disappeared resources. Every territory gets a full accounting of what we're taking and why. That'll cause panic. Better panic with information than compliance through ignorance. He turned to Sable. You wanted to help rebuild systems. Here's your first task. Design a communication framework that keeps territories informed without triggering mass revolt. She felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like a physical thing. How much time do I have? 6 hours. We need messages dispatched by nightfall. Astrid headed for the door. I'll mobilize the commanders, get troop deployments ready for your approval. She left and the hall felt emptier. Just Sable and Kalen and the maps and the crushing realization that they'd gone from dismantling one empire to desperately trying to hold together what remained. Sable pulled parchment and ink toward her, mind already racing through communication strategies. Regional governors needed context without feeling threatened. Merchants needed reassurance without false promises. Common citizens needed to understand why conscription was necessary without feeling betrayed by the same government that had just voided child trafficking agreements. It was impossible. She wrote it anyway. 3 hours in, her hand cramped and her head pounded, and the words were starting to blur together. She'd drafted 17 different versions, each one failing to balance honesty with reassurance. Too transparent and territories would panic. Too vague, and they'd assume the worst. Kaylin had been reading reports at the far end of the table, methodically working through border intelligence and supply manifests. Now he looked up, watching her struggle. "You're trying to make them feel safe. That's the goal. Don't." His voice was quiet. "Don't lie to them about safety. Tell them the truth. We're vulnerable. We're restructuring. We need their support because the alternative is collapse. People respect honesty more than false comfort, even when the honesty is terrifying, especially then." She looked at what she'd written. Careful language designed to minimize alarm. Bureaucratic phrasing that said nothing substantial. The kind of communication she'd seen from every government she'd ever mapped. She tore it up and started over. This time, she wrote the truth. Blunt and unpolished. The council had fractured over fundamental disagreements about empire values. Military mobilization was necessary to secure borders while internal restructuring happened. Conscription would be implemented fairly with full transparency about deployments and expected duration. And yes, it was dangerous. Yes, they were vulnerable, but the alternative was returning to systems that required trafficking children to maintain trade relationships, and that price was too high. She pushed the draft across the table to Kaylin. Too honest. He read it in silence, then looked up, and something in his expression had shifted. "This is perfect. Send it. It'll cause panic. It'll cause trust." He stood, moving around the table. People aren't stupid. They know when they're being managed. This treats them like adults who deserve to understand the stakes. She dispatched the messages through Astrid's communication network, each one sealed with royal authority and sent to regional governors across Stormfall. Then she collapsed back in her chair, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Kaylin sat across from her, and for the first time since they'd returned from the forest, he looked something close to human. Tired. Uncertain. Carrying weight that was visible in the lines around his eyes. "You asked earlier how long we have." His voice was quiet. "The truth is, I don't know. Empires don't collapse on schedules. They fracture slowly and then all at once. We could have months to stabilize. Or we could wake up tomorrow to find the Frostmark clans at our northern border and half our territories in open revolt. Then we deal with it tomorrow." You make it sound simple. It is simple. Not easy, but simple. She leaned forward. "We identify the biggest threat. We address it with whatever resources we have. We survive long enough to identify the next threat. Repeat until either we stabilize or we don't. And if we don't, then at least we went down fighting for something that mattered instead of maintaining something rotten." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. His grip was warm, calloused, the hand of someone who'd held weapons and signed orders and carried weight that should have broken him years ago. "Thank you." For what? For not letting me do this alone. The moment stretched, neither of them moving, and Sable felt something shift between them. Something that went beyond partnership or political alliance. Something that felt dangerous and necessary and completely inevitable. The door crashed open. They jerked apart as Astrid burst in, face pale, holding a blood-stained message. Her hands were shaking. Kaylin was on his feet instantly. "What happened?" "Marin." Astrid's voice was hollow. "She's dead." The words didn't make sense. Marin had left 3 hours ago. Had walked out of this hall alive and calculating and impossible to kill because she'd survived every court intrigue for 40 years. How? Kaylin's voice was strangled. Poison. In her evening wine, Astrid placed the message on the table. This was pinned to her door. Sable read it over Kaylin's shoulder. The handwriting was elegant, precise. "The old order will not fall quietly. You chose disruption. We choose survival. One counselor dead, more to follow. Restore the agreements or watch your empire bleed. No signature, no identifying marks, just threat delivered with surgical precision. Kaelin's hands clenched into fists. Brennan, maybe. Astrid's voice was tight. Or Voss. Or House Varn operating through proxies. Or any of a dozen factions who see you as vulnerable and want to send a message. Find them. We're trying. But whoever did this knew Marin's security protocols, knew which servants to bribe, knew exactly how to make it look like natural causes until we found the note. His expression went absolutely cold. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned. Planned before Brennan was exiled, before you voided the Varn agreement. Astrid met his gaze. Someone's been positioning pieces for weeks, maybe months, waiting for the right moment to strike. The implications settled over the room like ash. They weren't just facing political fracture. They were facing coordinated opposition, someone who'd been watching and waiting and preparing to dismantle everything the moment Kaelin showed weakness. And he'd given them the opening when he'd chosen Sable over stability. She saw it in his expression, the calculation, the doubt, the question of whether saving 7 children and 1 cartographer was worth the counselor's blood now staining his hands. Don't. Her voice cut through his spiral. Don't you dare second-guess the choice. A woman is dead. A woman who knew the risks. Sable stood, moving around the table. Marin told me palace politics were deadly. She survived 40 years by being smarter and more ruthless than her enemies. If someone finally outmaneuvered her, that's not on you. I created the conditions. You created the possibility of change. The people who killed her chose violence to prevent it. She grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. Don't let them weaponize guilt. That's how they win. They're already winning, his voice was raw. The council's fractured, territories are mobilizing, and now they're killing the counselors who stayed loyal. How is that not winning? Because we're still standing, because we haven't folded, because every breath we take without surrendering is another second they have to worry about what we'll do next. Astrid cleared her throat. As inspiring as this is, we need a response. Marin's death will be public knowledge within hours. The remaining counselors will panic. Some will flee. Others will demand we capitulate to whoever sent the message. Then we don't give them the chance to panic. Kaelin's voice hardened. Immediate lockdown. No one enters or leaves the fortress without my direct authorization. Every counselor, every advisor, every servant gets protective detail. And we send a message of our own. What kind of message? The kind that makes it clear we don't negotiate with assassins. He moved to the war room, Astrid and Sable following. The maps were still spread across the table, borders and territories and pressure points. Kaelin studied them with the focused intensity of someone planning war. Whoever killed Marin wants us afraid, wants us second-guessing every choice. His finger traced the northern border. So we do the opposite. We accelerate. Full military mobilization. Immediate deployment to contested border zones. We show the Frostmark clans and House Varn and every other enemy watching that internal politics haven't made us weak. That's aggressive. That's survival. He looked at Astrid. How fast can you mobilize? 48 hours for full deployment, 24 for advanced units. Do it. And send word to the remaining counselors. Emergency session. Tomorrow at dawn. Non-negotiable attendance. They'll be terrified. Good. Fear makes people honest. Astrid left to execute orders, and Sable found herself alone with Kaelin again. This time, the silence was different. Heavier. Weighted with death and consequence, and the growing realization that they'd crossed into territory where every decision carried body count. You're not sleeping tonight. It wasn't a question. Neither are you. He almost smiled. No. I'm going to spend the next 6 hours reviewing every security protocol and trying to identify who wants me dead badly enough to kill my counselors. That's a long list. Probably. He moved to the window, looking out over the fortress. The irony is, Brennan was right about one thing. I am letting emotion override strategy. A strategic ruler would reinstate the trade agreements, would sacrifice you and Tam and the moral high ground to maintain stability. But you won't. No. Because stability purchased with atrocity isn't worth having, even if it costs you everything, especially then. He turned from the window. My father built an empire on calculated brutality, and it hollowed him out, made him into something that couldn't remember why power mattered. I'd rather lose the crown than become that. Noble sentiment. Won't stop the assassins. No. But it'll mean something when they finally get me. Don't talk like that. Why not? It's the logical endpoint. He gestured toward the maps. I'm governing with a fractured council, facing external military pressure, and being hunted by someone skilled enough to poison a 40-year veteran of palace intrigue. The mathematics aren't in my favor. Then we change the mathematics. How? By finding whoever killed Marin and making them regret it. She said it with more confidence than she felt, but Kaylin's expression shifted. Not quite hope, but maybe it's shadow. You really think we can identify them? I think assassins make mistakes. They have to. Because perfect murders require perfect knowledge, and no one has that. She moved to the table, studying Marin's final message. Whoever did this knew her security protocols, knew her wine supplier, knew which servants to bribe. That's not general knowledge. That's insider information. So we're looking for someone with access, or someone who bought access from someone with it. She traced the elegant handwriting. This is educated, expensive education, the kind that comes from noble houses or merchant families, that narrows it to about 200 people. Then we start eliminating. Who benefits from Marin's death? Everyone who wants the old system restored. Kaylin's voice was grim. She was the only senior counselor who publicly supported my reforms. With her gone, the remaining 2 are junior advisors who will be terrified into compliance or resignation. So the killer's goal is isolation. Make you govern alone. Make every decision yours with no buffer of council authority, which makes me solely responsible when things collapse. He saw it now. The strategy. The long game. Not just assassination, political demolition. Then we don't let them isolate you, Sable's mind raced. The remaining counselors. Can you trust them? Define trust. Will they stand with you even if it's dangerous? One will. Junior trade advisor named Petra. She's young, idealistic, reminds me of you actually. And the other, Marcus. Military background. Loyal to the crown more than the person wearing it. He'll stay as long as he thinks I'm competent. Then we work with what we have. 3 counselors is better than none, and we find replacements who share your vision before your enemies can position their own candidates. Where do you propose we find these mythical, reform-minded leaders? She thought about it. About 7 children scattered in a forest. About Kira with her brand scar and her fierce protectiveness. About people who'd survived systems designed to break them and came out the other side with something resembling conscience. We look in the places power usually ignores. The outer territories. The people who've survived your father's empire despite it, instead of because of it. The ones who understand what needs to change because they've lived the cost of maintaining the status quo. You want to appoint commoners to the council. I want to appoint people who'll fight for this because they actually believe in it, not because it serves their political advancement. The council will revolt. The council already revolted. She gestured toward the empty chairs. You're rebuilding anyway. Might as well build something that works instead of replicating what failed. He studied her with that same intensity, then nodded slowly. All right, draft criteria. What kind of people we're looking for, what qualifications matter, and start identifying candidates in the outer territories. How much time do I have? Until dawn. The emergency council session. I want names to present. That's 8 hours. Then you'd better start now. She left him in the war room and headed for the archives, mind already spinning through territory maps and population records, and the impossible task of identifying leaders in places where leadership had been systematically crushed for generations. The archives were cold and dusty, shelves packed with records dating back centuries, tax ledgers, military deployments, trade manifests, the bureaucratic skeleton of empire. She pulled territorial governance reports, scanning for patterns. Which territories had the lowest crime rates? Which had successfully negotiated disputes without military intervention? Which had community structures that functioned despite minimal oversight from Blackwater Keep? 3 hours in, she'd identified 12 potential candidates. People who'd organized disaster relief after floods, who'd mediated territorial disputes, who'd built schools or irrigation systems or anything that indicated capacity for leadership beyond personal gain. She was drafting qualification criteria when footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Too heavy to be a servant, too deliberate to be casual. Sable's hand found the knife at her belt, the small blade Astrid had given her that suddenly felt inadequate. She positioned herself behind a shelf with sightlines to the door. The footsteps stopped just outside. Then Astrid's voice, pitched to Carrie. "You can come out. It's just me." Sable emerged, releasing breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "You walk loud for an assassin." Wasn't trying to be subtle. Was trying not to get stabbed by a jumpy cartographer. "Fair." Sable returned the knife to her belt. "What are you doing here? Kalen sent me. He thought you might want company while sorting through the Empire's dirty laundry." Astrid moved to the table, scanning the document Sable had pulled. "Plus, someone needs to make sure you don't get poisoned like Marin. You think the killer would try again tonight? I think whoever did this is confident and organized and probably watching to see how we respond." Astrid pulled a flask from her coat, offering it. "Water. From my personal supply. Not poisoned unless I've decided to kill myself." Sable drank, the cold water cutting through hours of dust and tension. "Found anything useful?" 12 candidates. She pushed the list across. People who've demonstrated leadership capacity in territories that barely have governance infrastructure. Astrid scanned the names. "You're serious about appointing commoners. I'm serious about appointing competent people who'll actually fight for this instead of calculating personal advantage. The council will lose their minds. What's left of it?" The council lost their minds when Kalen voided the Varn agreement. "We're past worrying about their comfort." Astrid set down the flask. "You know what you're proposing requires, right? You'll have to bring these people to Blackwater, vet them, train them in governance procedures they've never encountered, all while facing external military threats and internal assassination plots." "Yes. And you think it's worth the risk? I think the alternative is replicating the same broken system with different faces." Sable met her gaze. "You said once that survival isn't about being good. It's about being ruthless enough to protect what matters. This is me being ruthless. I'm protecting the possibility of something better, even if it's harder than maintaining what's familiar." Astrid studied her for a long moment. "You've changed." "Have I?" "The woman who cut those chains was acting on instinct. You're acting on strategy. That's different. Is it better? Depends on whether you survive long enough to see your strategy work." Astrid pulled the list closer, examining names. "I'll run background on these candidates, see if any of them have connections to the factions that want Kalen dead." "You think someone on this list could be compromised?" "I think anyone can be compromised with the right pressure. Money, family threats, blackmail. Trust is earned slowly and destroyed fast. Then we vet carefully and move quickly." They worked through the night, Astrid running intelligence while Sable drafted governance frameworks that could accommodate people with no formal training. By the time dawn broke gray and cold through the archive windows, they had 8 confirmed candidates and preliminary frameworks for rapid onboarding. Sable gathered the documents, exhaustion making her movements clumsy. The emergency council session started in 30 minutes. Barely enough time to clean up and look presentable. Astrid followed her through empty corridors toward the guest quarters. The fortress was waking, servants starting morning routines, guards changing watch. The machinery of Empire grinding forward despite fracture and death and uncertainty. At her door, Astrid paused. "Sable, whatever happens in that council session, however they react to your proposals, don't back down." "I wasn't planning to." "Good, because they're going to push. They're going to call you naive and inexperienced and dangerous. And if you flinch, if you show doubt, they'll tear you apart." Inspiring pep talk. "I'm not here to inspire. I'm here to prepare you for combat." Astrid's expression was hard, because that's what council sessions are now. Combat by other means. And you're walking in carrying proposals that will seem radical to people who've spent their lives maintaining status quo. "Then I'll fight. Make sure you win." Astrid left and Sable entered her quarters, stripping off clothes that smelled like dust and sweat and fear. She washed quickly in cold water, changed into clean garments that approximated formal council attire, and braided her hair with fingers that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. The pendant Kalen had given her hung against her collarbone. Silver catching morning light. Royal protection that had already failed Marin. She tucked it inside her shirt and headed for the council chamber. The room felt emptier with half the chairs vacant. Just Petra and Marcus flanking Kalen's elevated seat, both looking pale and terrified. Astrid stood against the wall, arms crossed. And in the center of the floor, right where Sable had stood when Brennan first called for her execution, a bloodstain. Someone had tried to clean it, but the stone held memory. Dark patch that wouldn't quite fade. Evidence that council chambers weren't neutral ground anymore. Kalen entered last, moving with controlled exhaustion that mirrored her own. He took his seat, and the remaining councilors rose in automatic deference. Sit. His voice carried authority even when it was tired. We have work to do. Petra spoke first, her voice shaking. My lord, Councillor Marin's death. Do we know who... No. But we're investigating. Kalen's gaze swept the sparse assembly. Which brings us to our first order of business. This council cannot function with 3 members. We need replacements. Immediately. Marcus leaned forward, military bearing evident, even seated. Where do you propose we find candidates? Most qualified administrators have already fled or are aligned with the resigned councillors. Then we expand our definition of qualified. Kalen gestured to Sable. Royal Advisor Cressmore has identified 8 candidates from outer territories, people with demonstrated leadership capacity in difficult circumstances. Petra's eyes widened. Commoners. Citizens with competence and commitment. Kalen's voice hardened. I'm done appointing people based on bloodlines and political connections. I want counselors who will fight for Stormfall because they understand what's at stake, not because it advances their family interests. Marcus's expression was skeptical. My lord, with respect, governance requires expertise. You can't just watch me. Kalen stood. Sable, present your candidates. She moved to the center of the floor, acutely aware of the bloodstain near her feet. The documents felt heavy in her hands. The first candidate is Elena Tross from the West March territory. She organized relief efforts after the flooding 3 years ago, coordinating 7 villages and securing emergency supplies through negotiation with local merchants. No formal training, but demonstrated capacity for crisis management and resource allocation. Petra looked uncertain. What qualifications does she have for governing millions? She kept 800 people alive when the regional governor fled and left them to drown. Sable's voice was hard. That's more qualification than half the previous council had. Marcus's frown deepened. And the others? Sable went through the list. A former military captain who'd prevented a territory war through negotiation. A merchant who'd built schools in 3 villages. A healer who'd organized medical services in regions with no governance infrastructure. Each candidate was an outsider. Each one had survived despite the Empire instead of because of it. When she finished, the silence was heavy. Petra broke it first. These people have no experience with policy. They have experience with consequences. Sable cut her off. They know what it costs when policies fail because they've lived through it. That's worth more than a decade of theoretical governance training. Marcus shook his head. This is unprecedented. The council has always drawn from established houses. The council has always been complicit in maintaining systems that required child trafficking. Kalen's voice was ice. Forgive me if I'm not particularly interested in maintaining their traditions. My lord, Marcus's voice rose. I understand your frustration, but appointing untested commoners during a crisis is exactly what we need, because tested nobles are the ones who fractured this government and fled when I asked them to choose conscience over commerce. The accusation hung in the air. Marcus's jaw tightened. I stayed. You did, and I'm grateful. But you stayed out of loyalty to the crown, not conviction about the changes I'm implementing. Kalen's gaze was steady. I need counselors who believe in this, who will fight for it even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous. And if these commoners can't handle the pressure, if they make mistakes that cost lives, then we'll live with it. Same as we've been living with the mistakes of noble counselors who thought bloodlines made them qualified. Petra's voice was small. When do they arrive? Tomorrow. Kalen's tone made it clear this wasn't negotiable. Astrid's already dispatched riders. They'll be given accelerated briefings on governance protocols and seated within a week. A week? Marcus stood abruptly. My lord, this is madness. This is evolution. Kalen's voice cracked like a whip. And you can either evolve with us or join the others who decided maintaining tradition was more important than survival. Marcus went pale. Are you threatening to exile me? I'm asking you to choose. Stay and support this restructuring, or leave with my blessing and no hard feelings. But I won't tolerate internal sabotage from people who claim loyalty while undermining every reform. The silence stretched taut. Then Marcus slowly sat back down. I'll stay. But I reserve the right to disagree when I think you're wrong. That's all I ask. Kaelin's posture eased fractionally. Petra? She nodded quickly. I'll support the appointments. Though I think we should have backup candidates in case any of them decline. They won't decline. Sable's voice was certain. I've reviewed their histories. These are people who've spent their lives trying to fix broken systems from the outside. Given the chance to fix them from the inside, they'll take it. Kaelin moved down the steps toward her. Then it's decided. Emergency appointments effective immediately. The new council will be operational within 10 days. And in the meantime, Petra's voice trembled. While we're vulnerable, while we're transitioning, what happens if the Frostmark clans attack? Or House Varn moves against us? We fight. Kaelin's voice was flat. With everything we have, and we trust that 8 competent commoners will serve us better than 12 compromised nobles. He dismissed the council, and Sable found herself alone with him in the chamber, standing on the bloodstain where Marin's influence had bled out. You handled that well. His voice was quiet. I'm terrified. Good. Complacency gets you killed. He moved to the window, looking out over the fortress. The new counselors arrive tomorrow. That gives us 24 hours to prepare briefing materials and security protocols. After that we find out if competence and conviction can hold an empire together when everything else is falling apart. Yes. She joined him at this window. The courtyard below was active, soldiers drilling, servants working, the empire grinding forward despite everything. Kaelin. She kept her voice low. What Astrid said. About you becoming your father. Are you afraid of that? Terrified. The admission was raw, unguarded. Because I can feel it. The pull toward absolute authority. The temptation to stop listening and just command. It would be easier, faster, more efficient, and every time I resist it, I wonder if I'm being weak or strong. You're being human. My father was human too. And look what that got him. Your father never had someone willing to call him on his choices. You do I? She took his hand, the gesture feeling both natural and completely unprecedented. You have me, and I will never let you become what you're afraid of, even if it means fighting you, even if it costs me everything. He looked at their joined hands, then at her face, and something in his expression cracked. The king's mask falling away to reveal the person underneath, vulnerable and exhausted and desperately trying not to break. I don't deserve you, probably not, but you're stuck with me anyway. He almost smiled. Then his expression shifted, hardened. Because the door was opening and Astrid was entering with news written in the grim set of her shoulders. Frostmark clans just crossed the northern border. 3,000 troops, full battle formation. She placed a map on the table. They're not testing. This is invasion. And the weight that had lifted fractionally came crashing back down, heavier than before. 3,000 troops. The number echoed in Sable's skull like a death knell. She'd mapped enough territories to understand what 3,000 disciplined fighters could do to an unprepared border. They could sweep through towns like fire through dry grass, could carve through defensive positions that hadn't been reinforced in years, could reach Blackwater Keep in less than a week if nothing slowed them down. Kaelin's face had gone absolutely still. That expressionless mask leaders wear when they're calculating how many of their people are about to die. How many deployments? Where? Astrid unrolled the map with hands that were rock steady despite the catastrophe she'd just announced. Northern border. 3 entry points. Main force here. She tapped a mountain pass. Approximately 2,000 troops. Secondary forces splitting east and west to flank any defensive positions we establish. Standard invasion doctrine. Kaelin's voice was clinical. Overwhelm the center. Prevent lateral reinforcement, establish forward positions before we can mobilize response. His finger traced the terrain. How long until they reach the border towns? 36 hours. Maybe less if they force march. And our current deployments, 800 troops scattered across 3 northern outposts, none of them fortified for sustained siege. Astrid's expression was grim. We can pull reserves from the southern territories, but that leaves us exposed to House Varn. And mobilization takes time we don't have. The mathematics were brutal. 800 defenders against 3,000 attackers across terrain that favored mobility over fortification. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre with a 48-hour delay. Sable studied the map, her cartographer's eye catching details that military training might overlook. The mountain pass Astrid had indicated was narrow, defensible if you didn't mind sacrificing the towns behind it. But there were other routes, smaller passes that wouldn't accommodate a full army but could funnel strike forces. Here, she pointed to a secondary pass marked in faded ink. And here, if they're splitting forces for flanking maneuvers, they're using these routes, which means we can cut their supply lines if we move fast enough. Kaylin saw it immediately. Small mobile units hit the flanking forces before they can establish position, force them back into the main column. That's guerrilla tactics. Astrid's voice carried doubt. We'd need fighters who know the terrain, who can move through mountain passes without getting lost or picked off. We have fighters like that. Kaylin turned from the map. The Outer Territory militias. They've been defending their own borders for years with minimal support from Blackwater. They know every pass, every cave, every hidden route the clans might use. They also have no formal training and questionable loyalty to a government that's been ignoring them for decades. Astrid crossed her arms. You're gambling that they'll fight for you instead of negotiating their own terms with the invaders. I'm gambling that they'll fight for their homes. Kaylin's jaw tightened. The Frostmark clans don't negotiate. They conquer. Every territory they've ever taken gets stripped and subjugated. The militia commanders know that. And if they don't trust you enough to follow orders, then we lose. His voice was flat. But we lose anyway if we try to fight conventional warfare with 1/4 the troops. At least this gives us a chance. The brutal honesty of it settled over the room. This wasn't strategy born from strength. This was desperation wearing a tactical framework and hoping it held together long enough to matter. There's something else. Sable kept her voice steady. The Frostmark clans, they're not opportunistic raiders. They're organized, disciplined. This invasion was planned months in advance, which means someone told them we'd be vulnerable. Kaylin's expression went dark. Someone gave them intelligence about our council fracture, our reduced defensive capability, the exact moment to strike. Brennan. Astrid's voice was cold. Or Voss. Or any of the resigned counselors who decided selling military intelligence was preferable to watching you dismantle their comfortable empire. Can we prove it? Not in time to matter. She gestured to the map. Right now, proof is irrelevant. We have 36 hours to organize a defense against an invasion force 3 times our size. Treason trials can wait until after we're not all dead. Kaylin moved to the window, staring out at the fortress that was about to become the last line of defense against total collapse. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd just accepted that survival required becoming something he'd spent years trying not to be. Full military authority, no council approval needed, no bureaucratic delay. I want every available fighter mobilized within 12 hours. Militia commanders summoned immediately. And someone get me the tactical profiles on every Frostmark officer we have intelligence on. Astrid nodded. Already done. She pulled documents from her coat. Their lead commander is Warlord Grevik, 53 years old, 20 campaigns across 4 territories. He doesn't take risks, and he doesn't show mercy. If he's leading this invasion, they're planning full occupation, not just a punitive raid. Then we make occupation too expensive to maintain. Kaylin turned back to the map. What's the terrain like around the main pass? Narrow corridor, steep walls on both sides. Perfect choke point if we had enough troops to hold it. Astrid's finger traced the geography. But we don't. They'll push through and establish forward position. After that, it's open terrain all the way to the border towns. So we don't try to hold the pass. We let them through. The silence that followed was absolute. Sable saw it first. Saw the strategy forming in the negative space of what wasn't being said. You want to let 3,000 enemy troops establish position on our side of the border. I want them stretched thin. Kaylin's voice was hard. Supply lines extended. Flanking forces separated from the main column. And then we hit them from every direction at once with fighters who know the terrain better than they do. That's insane. Marcus had entered without anyone noticing, his military bearing rigid with disbelief. You're proposing to cede territory to draw them deeper into a trap. I'm proposing to use their confidence against them. Grevik doesn't take risks, which means he'll assume we're too weak to mount effective resistance. He'll push through the pass, establish forward position, and wait for his flanking forces to secure lateral approach. That's when we strike. With what forces? Marcus moved to the map. Even if we mobilize every militia in the Northern Territories, we're still outnumbered 2-1. Numbers aren't everything. Kalen's gaze was steady. Grevik's troops are trained for conventional warfare, formation fighting, siege tactics. They're not trained for guerrilla operations in hostile terrain against fighters who'd rather die than surrender their homes. You're betting the Empire on mountain farmers with hunting bows. I'm betting the Empire on people who have something worth fighting for. Kalen's voice carried an edge. Your professional soldiers fight for pay and duty. The militias fight for survival. That makes them more dangerous than any formal training. Marcus's jaw tightened. And when those militia fighters die in ambushes that military training could have prevented, when their families are slaughtered because they followed your orders into suicide missions, will you tell them their conviction was worth more than competence? The accusation hung in the air like a blade. Kalen moved toward Marcus with the controlled fury of someone who'd been holding back too long. You want to lecture me about casualties? Fine. Let's talk about the last war my father fought. Conventional tactics, professional soldiers. He sacrificed 800 men holding a pass that could have been flanked. 800 corpses because strategy said, you don't cede territory. I buried some of them myself. I remember what conviction without adaptation costs. This is different. This is exactly the same. Kalen's voice cracked. We're outmatched and undermanned and one wrong decision away from total collapse. The only difference is I'm willing to adapt instead of dying for tactics that stopped working 3 wars ago. Marcus held his gaze for 5 seconds, then 10. Finally, he inclined his head fractionally. What do you need from me? Mobilize every reserve unit, get them to the northern border within 24 hours, and send word to the militia commanders. I need them here for tactical briefing in 6 hours. Marcus left without another word, posture radiating disagreement even as he moved to execute orders. Astrid waited until his footsteps faded. He's going to undermine you. Maybe not openly, but he'll plant doubt with the commanders. Make them question whether your strategy is brilliant or suicidal. Probably. Kalen's voice was tired. But he'll follow orders. And right now, that's all I can ask for. Sable moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. You're asking people to die for a strategy that might not work. I'm asking people to fight for something worth preserving. There's a difference. Is there? When the bodies start piling up, when families lose fathers and sons and daughters, will the difference matter to them? He turned to face her, and the exhaustion in his eyes was absolute. No, it won't. They'll hate me either way. But at least this way, they'll hate me for trying something new instead of repeating the same failures that got us here. That's bleak comfort. It's the only comfort leaders get. The weight of it pressed down on her. This was what Marin had tried to warn her about, what Astrid had been preparing her for. The reality that power wasn't about making good choices. It was about making terrible ones and living with the consequences while everyone else measured you by results you couldn't control. What do you need from me? Her voice was steady despite the fear. I need you to do something impossible. He pulled a second map from the stack, this one marked with population centers and resource distributions. The new counselors arrive tomorrow. They're walking into an empire at war with no training and no context. I need you to brief them. Get them operational. Turn civilians into governance within 48 hours while I'm managing military deployment. You want me to run the civilian government while you fight a war. I want you to make sure there's something left to govern when the war's over. His expression was intense. Because if we win this battle but lose our infrastructure, if we save the borders but let the territories collapse, we've accomplished nothing. She took the map, feeling the weight of ink and parchment, an impossible responsibility. I don't know how to run a government. Neither did I when I inherited this crown. You learn by doing. And by accepting that failure is always possible, but capitulation is guaranteed death. Before she could respond, the door crashed open and Petra stumbled in, face pale, holding a message sealed with black wax. My lord, her voice shook, this just arrived. From House Varn. Kalen broke the seal, reading in silence. His expression went carefully blank, the kind of blank that meant rage being compressed into something manageable. He handed the message to Sable without comment. She read it twice to make sure she understood. To King Kalen Virex. In light of recent instability within Stormfall governance and credible reports of military vulnerability, House Varn hereby suspends all existing trade agreements pending renegotiation of terms. Additionally, we demand immediate restoration of previously voided contracts, including labor transfer provisions, or we will consider alternative arrangements with territorial governors who may be more amenable to reasonable commerce. You have 72 hours to respond. High Merchant Varn. It was a declaration of economic war wrapped in diplomatic language. Varn was betting that the Frostmark invasion would either destroy Kalen or force him to capitulate. Either way, the merchant house positioned itself to profit. Sable's hands tightened on the parchment. They're coordinating with the clans. Maybe. Or just opportunistic vultures circling what they think is a dying empire. Kalen took the message back, methodically tearing it into strips. Doesn't matter. The answer is the same, which is, we ignore them. He let the torn pieces fall. Varn wants us desperate enough to restore child trafficking agreements. I'd rather lose the empire than give them that satisfaction. My lord? Petra's voice was small. If we lose Varn's trade network, the southern territories will face immediate shortages. Food, medicine, basic supplies. People will suffer. People are already suffering. Kalen's voice was hard. The question is whether that suffering serves a purpose or just maintains systems that create more suffering. I'm done choosing the latter. But if they die, then they die fighting for something better instead of living under something rotten. He moved toward the door. Get the civilian briefing materials ready. The new counselors need to hit the ground running. He left, and Sable stood surrounded by maps and impossible tasks, and the growing realization that they were fighting on three fronts simultaneously: military invasion from the north, economic siege from the south, internal fracture from the very structures they were trying to rebuild. Any one of those fronts could destroy them. All three at once was mathematically apocalyptic. Petra moved beside her, voice tentative. Do you really think we can survive this? Sable looked at the young counselor. Barely 25. Idealistic in the way of people who hadn't yet learned that idealism got you killed unless you armored it with ruthlessness. I think we don't have a choice except to try. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. She spent the next 4 hours preparing briefing documents that would somehow transform 8 civilians into functional counselors during an active war. Governance frameworks, emergency protocols, resource allocation strategies, all of it theoretical until tested against reality that didn't care about preparation. The new counselors arrived at dawn, brought through the gates under heavy escort. 8 people who looked exactly like what they were, outsiders being thrust into a world they barely understood. Elena Tross was first through the door. 40-something weathered skin that spoke of years managing disaster relief in territories where government meant absence rather than assistance. She moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned not to waste energy on uncertainty. Behind her, the others filed in, the former military captain with a scar bisecting his jaw, the merchant who'd built schools and looked uncomfortable in formal clothes, the healer whose hands couldn't quite stop moving, fingers tracing patterns like she was checking invisible patients for fever. They gathered in the great hall, and Sable saw them register the bloodstain on the floor, saw the moment they understood that council chambers weren't safe spaces for theoretical debate. She didn't give them time to panic. You're here because the empire is fracturing and we need people who understand what collapse looks like from the ground level. Her voice cut through the nervous silence. You're here because half the previous council resigned or fled or got murdered. You're here because in approximately 30 hours, 3,000 Frostmark fighters are going to try to carve through our northern border, and we need governance that can function while King Kalen fights to keep them out. Elena spoke first, voice steady. What do you need us to do? Learn faster than you've ever learned anything. Make decisions with incomplete information, except that some of those decisions will get people killed, and you'll have to live with it. She gestured to the maps covering the walls. This is Stormfall. These are our territories. These are our enemies. And this is the government structure you're now part of. She spent 6 hours on compressed briefings. Territory governance, resource management, emergency protocols for civilian evacuation if the northern border collapsed. She didn't soften the reality, didn't pretend they had time for gentle orientation. The former captain, his name was Davos, asked the question she'd been waiting for. Why us? Why pull farmers and merchants and healers into a council that requires expertise we don't have? Because expertise without conviction got us here. Sable met his gaze. The previous council had decades of experience. They used it to build systems that required trafficking children to maintain trade relationships. I'll take your inexperience and integrity over their competence and corruption. And if we make mistakes, you will. So will I. So does King Kalen. The question isn't whether you'll make mistakes, it's whether you'll make them while trying to build something worth preserving or while maintaining something that should have burned years ago. The healer, Mira, raised her hand tentatively. The king. Is he... She struggled for words. We've heard stories. That he's abandoning everything his father built. That he's choosing personal conviction over empire stability. He's choosing evolution over stagnation. Sable's voice was firm. His father built an empire on calculated brutality. It worked. For a while. But it also hollowed out everyone inside it, made them into people who could justify atrocity with spreadsheets. Kalen's trying to prove that power can serve purpose beyond its own perpetuation. That sounds idealistic. It is. But idealism armed with strategy and backed by people willing to fight for it becomes revolution. And revolution is what we need. Elena's expression shifted. She'd been skeptical, measuring, calculating risk against reward. Now something had changed, hardened. When do we start? You already have. Sable pulled a stack of documents forward. These are the southern territories facing supply shortages because House Varn suspended trade agreements. I need allocation strategies that keep people fed without capitulating to their demands. The council worked through scenarios, argued, disagreed, found solutions that weren't perfect but were workable. And somewhere in the process of problem solving under impossible pressure, they stopped being civilians and started becoming something resembling government. Night fell, and Sable dismissed them to quarters, her own exhaustion so complete she could barely walk straight. She made it halfway to her room before Kalen found her in a corridor that smelled like torch smoke and old stone. He looked worse than she felt. Uniform dusty from inspecting deployments, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, but his eyes were sharp, still calculating. The new council. How are they? Terrified, overwhelmed, asking questions that don't have good answers. She leaned against the wall because standing was suddenly difficult. But they're fighting. That's more than the last council did. Good. He moved closer and she could see dried blood on his hands. Not his, someone else's. How many briefing hours? 6, maybe 7. I lost track. That's not sustainable. Nothing about this is sustainable. We're governing during invasion with a skeleton council and no trade agreements and enemies circling like sharks. Sustainable went out the window when you chose conscience over compromise. He almost smiled. Regret it. Ask me when we're not all dead. The moment stretched, neither of them moving. The corridor empty except for distant sounds of soldiers preparing for deployment. For war that was coming whether they were ready or not. Kalen reached up, fingers brushing the pendant at her throat, the one he'd given her for protection. Still wear it. Haven't taken it off. It didn't save Marin. I'm not Marin. Sable's voice was quiet. And I'm not planning to drink poisoned wine in the dark and hope for the best. Smart. His hand dropped, but he didn't step back. Sable, what I'm asking you to do, running civilian government during war, it's going to break you. The decisions, the casualties, the impossible choices between bad options and worse ones. You'll make calls that get people killed, and you'll have to keep governing anyway. I know. Do you? Because knowing theoretically and living with it are different things. I've watched it hollow out counselors who had decades of experience. You're walking into it with days of preparation and conviction that hasn't been tested against sustained atrocity. Then I'll learn. Same as you did. I don't want you to become what I became. What's that? Someone who can sign execution orders over breakfast and sleep soundly because the alternative is feeling everything and shattering. His voice was raw. Someone who's forgotten what it's like to make decisions without calculating body count first. You haven't forgotten. She reached up, touching his face. You're terrified of forgetting. That's different. Is it? Yes. Because the people who've truly forgotten don't fear it anymore. He closed his eyes briefly, and she saw the weight he was carrying. Not just the empire. Not just the war. but the knowledge that every choice he made from here forward would either save them or destroy them, and there was no way to know which until bodies started falling. When he opened his eyes again, something had shifted, decided. I need you to promise me something. What? If this goes wrong? If the invasion succeeds? If we lose? His voice was steady despite what he was asking. You run. You take the children we freed. You take whoever from the council will follow. And you disappear into territories where the clans won't find you. No. Sable? No. She cut him off. I'm not running. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. We're partners. That means we fight together or we fall together. That's not strategic. I don't care. Her voice was hard. You asked me to share the weight, to keep you from becoming your father. I can't do that from 100 miles away watching the empire burn. If you stay and we lose, you die. Then I die fighting for something that mattered, better than living safely while everything I believe in gets crushed. The fury in his expression was absolute, but underneath it, something else. Recognition, maybe even respect. You're impossible. I learned from the best. This time he did smile. Brief. Gone almost immediately, but real. The moment shattered when Astrid appeared at the corridor's end, moving fast. My lord, the militia commanders are here and they're not happy. Perfect. Because nothing about this situation calls for happiness. Kaelin's voice went cold. Professional. The king instead of the person. Where are they? War room. Waiting. And my lord. She paused. They brought demands, not requests. Demands. You need to see this. They moved through corridors that were too quiet. The fortress had gone still in the way buildings do when everyone inside knows death is approaching and they're counting breaths until it arrives. The war room was packed. 12 militia commanders from the northern territories, each one looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. They stood in a rough semicircle, and their body language screamed distrust. Elena Tross was already there, having followed from the council session. She stood against the wall, watching with the careful attention of someone learning a new language by immersion. Kaelin entered, and the temperature dropped fractionally. He didn't sit, didn't perform dominance, just stood at the head of the table and waited. The oldest commander spoke first, grizzled, maybe 60, face scarred from conflicts that predated Kaelin's birth. Name was Roth. I'll be direct. You're asking us to fight an invasion force 3 times our size with tactics that amount to suicide. I'm asking you to defend your territories using methods that give us a chance against superior numbers, by ceding ground to draw them into ambush positions. Roth's voice was flat. That's your strategy. Let them burn our towns while we hide in mountains and pick off stragglers. No. Kaelin's gaze was steady. The strategy is to make occupation more costly than conquest, to stretch their supply lines, to hit them from positions they can't fortify against, to make every mile they advance a bleeding wound that drains their capacity for sustained campaign. Pretty words. Another commander stepped forward, younger, female, built like someone who'd spent her life swinging a hammer. Name was Kessa. But they don't feed my people when the clans are burning our crops. They don't protect our families when Frostmark soldiers decide civilian casualties are acceptable losses, which is why we evacuate civilians before engaging, move them to fortified positions. Astrid had maps ready. These locations, defensible, supplied, far enough from engagement zones to, you're asking us to abandon our homes. Roth cut her off. To run and hope you can win a war with tactics you're inventing as you go. I'm asking you to survive. Kaelin's voice hardened. Because the alternative is defending fixed positions against an enemy with overwhelming force. You'll die. Your families will die, and the clans will march through your corpses to the next territory. So we're cowards or we're dead. Great options. No. You're smart or you're dead. Kaelin moved around the table. I'm not offering you heroic last stands. I'm offering you a chance to fight dirty and mean and effective enough that the clans decide occupying Stormfall costs more than it's worth. And if they don't decide that, if they push through our ambushes and keep coming, then we fall back to secondary positions and hit them again and again until either they withdraw or we run out of fighters, but we go down making them bleed for every inch. The silence was heavy. Kessa spoke quietly. You're different from your father. Yes, he would have conscripted us, sent us to die in formation, called it duty. He would have. Kaylin didn't flinch from it. I'm hoping you'll choose to fight because you understand what's at stake, not because I forced you. And what is at stake? Roth's expression was skeptical. Your crown, your empire. Why should we die for that? You shouldn't. Kaylin's voice was flat. If you're fighting for my crown, you'll break the first time casualties get heavy. I'm asking you to fight for your territories, for the possibility that governance can evolve into something that serves you instead of exploiting you, for the chance that your children inherit something better than what you survived. More pretty words. You want ugly truth. Fine. Kaylin's voice went cold. If you walk away, if you let the clans march through unopposed, you're signing death warrants for everyone in the Northern Territories. The Frostmark occupation protocol is systematic subjugation, labor camps, resource extraction, elimination of local governance structures. You've seen it in every territory they've conquered. That's what you're choosing if you refuse to fight. So we're trapped. Fight your war or die anyway. You were already trapped. I'm offering you the choice of how to fight. The commanders exchanged glances, calculating, weighing options that all ended in blood. Elena spoke from her position against the wall. If we evacuate civilians, where do they go? Blackwater Keep. Kaylin turned to her. We convert the southern barracks, set up emergency housing. It'll be crowded and uncomfortable, but it's better than leaving them exposed. That's thousands of refugees. Yes, we don't have resources for that scale of support. Then we find them. He looked at the militia commanders. You want proof I'm committed. There it is. I'm opening the fortress to your families, straining our supply lines, gambling our security, because I need you to know this isn't a distant conflict I'm managing from safety. This is shared survival. Roth studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, we'll fight, but on our terms. We know the terrain. We pick the ambush points, and if your strategy starts costing more lives than it's saving, we withdraw. Agreed. The other commanders followed Roth's lead, one by one, some reluctant, some resigned, all of them understanding they were choosing between terrible options and hoping they'd pick the less fatal one. Astrid distributed maps and tactical assignments, deployment schedules, evacuation routes, the mechanical details of warfare that transformed abstract strategy into concrete orders. The commanders filed out and Kaylin sagged against the table, exhaustion finally visible. That could have gone worse. Astrid's voice was dry. They don't trust me. No. But they trust that you're desperate enough to try something different. For militia commanders who've been abandoned by every previous government, that's almost hope. Sable moved to stand beside him. How long until they're in position? 20 hours. Astrid checked her notes. Evacuation starts at dawn. Military deployment follows. And then we find out if guerrilla warfare can stop an army designed to crush resistance. And the southern territories, the House Varn situation, still developing. Astrid's expression was grim. 3 governors have sent messages asking for guidance. They're caught between Varn's trade suspension and your refusal to capitulate. Some of them are considering independent negotiations. Tell them no. Kaylin's voice was hard. We don't fragment authority. Not now. If governors want to negotiate with Varn, they do it with crown approval and unified terms. And if they ignore you, then we deal with internal rebellion on top of external invasion. He straightened, forcing energy into a body that wanted to collapse. But we deal with it later. Right now, the clans are the immediate threat. The night dissolved into frantic preparation. Sable worked with the new council on refugee logistics. Kaylin coordinated military deployment. Astrid managed intelligence gathering and tried to identify who'd leaked their vulnerability to the Frostmark commanders. Somewhere around midnight, Sable found herself alone in the archive, surrounded by population records and supply manifests, trying to calculate how many refugees Blackwater Keep could absorb before infrastructure collapsed. The numbers didn't work. Too many people, not enough food, not enough space, not enough medical supplies for the injured that would inevitably flood in when the fighting started. She was still calculating impossible logistics when Tam appeared in the doorway. The boy looked small in the oversized sleep clothes someone had given him. His eyes were red from crying. Sable set down the quill. Can't sleep. He shook his head. I heard the soldiers talking, about war coming, about people dying. She gestured for him to come closer. He climbed onto the bench beside her, small and fragile, and carrying trauma that would probably never fully heal. Are we going to die? His voice was small. I don't know. She wouldn't lie to him, wouldn't offer false comfort that would shatter when reality arrived. We're fighting hard to make sure we don't, but war is unpredictable. Sometimes bravery and strategy aren't enough. I'm scared. Me too. He looked up at her. Really? Really? Being scared doesn't make you weak. It makes you smart. Fear is what keeps you alive when things get dangerous. Kira says you're brave, that you saved us from the bad men. I acted without thinking. That's different from brave. She says brave is acting even when you're scared, that cowards are the ones who let fear stop them. Sable pulled him close, feeling his small body shake with suppressed sobs. Kira's smarter than me. They sat in silence for a while. Child and cartographer surrounded by documents that detailed how many people might die in the next week, how many families would be destroyed, how many children like Tam would be orphaned by choices being made in war rooms and council chambers. Eventually, his breathing steadied, evened out, fell into the rhythm of sleep. She carried him back to the barracks where the other freed children slept under Kira's watchful guard. The soldier took him gently, settling him into bed without waking him. He trusts you. Kira's voice was quiet. He shouldn't. I have no idea what I'm doing, neither does anyone else, but you're doing it anyway. That counts for something. Does it? When the bodies start falling, when this all collapses, will it count then? Ask me when we're on the other side. Kira's smile was sad. Assuming we make it there. Sable left her with the sleeping children and found her way back to her quarters. Dawn was maybe 3 hours away. Barely enough time for sleep that wouldn't come anyway. She stripped off clothes that smelled like sweat and fear and desperation. Washed in cold water that made her skin prickle. Climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling while her mind replayed everything that could go wrong. The invasion succeeding, the militia breaking under pressure, House Varn's economic siege crushing the southern territories, internal rebellion from governors who decided independence was safer than loyalty, assassins finishing what they'd started with Marin. Any one of those scenarios ended in collapse. All of them together was apocalypse. She was still awake when someone knocked softly on the door. Kaylin's voice, barely audible. It's me. She opened it to find him standing in the corridor, still in his uniform, looking like he'd aged a decade in the last 24 hours. Can't sleep either. No. He stepped inside when she moved back. Just came from the northern observation post. The clans are ahead of schedule. They'll reach engagement range by tomorrow afternoon. That's 6 hours earlier than projected. Grevik's pushing hard, probably trying to catch us before we're fully deployed. He moved to the window. It's good strategy. If he hits before the militia's in position, we lose our defensive advantage. Can we accelerate deployment? Astrid's already trying, but moving that many fighters into mountain positions in the dark. She trailed off. It's dangerous. People will die from falls and exposure before we even engage the enemy. So we're racing against logistics and terrain and an enemy commander who knows exactly what he's doing. Yes, the weight of it pressed down on both of them, the impossible mathematics of warfare, the knowledge that every decision cascaded into consequences they couldn't control. Sable moved to stand beside him at the window. The fortress was dark except for torches at guard posts. The forest beyond was absolute blackness. Somewhere out there, 3,000 fighters were advancing, bringing fire and steel and systematic subjugation. Kaylin, she kept her voice low. What you said earlier about me running if this fails. You meant it. Every word. You'd stay and face it alone. I'm the king. It's my responsibility. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. He turned to face her. If Blackwater falls, if the clans breach the fortress, I need to know you're somewhere they can't reach. Because if they take you, if they use you as leverage, they'd break you. Yes. So you're asking me to become your weakness that needs protection instead of your partner who shares the fight. I'm asking you to survive. His voice was rough. Because someone needs to remember that this mattered, that we tried, that for a brief moment we chose something better even knowing it might destroy us. The vulnerability in his admission made her chest tight. This was a king preparing for death, making arrangements for after, accepting that sacrifice might be required and trying to ensure something survived even if he didn't. She reached up and pulled him down until their foreheads touched. I'm not leaving. I'm not running. We fight together or we die together. That's not negotiable. Sable? No. Her voice was hard. You want someone to remember. Fine. We'll both survive to remember. Or we'll both die fighting for something that mattered. But I won't be the one who runs while you burn. You're impossible. You already said that. Bears repeating. The moment stretched, neither of them moving, just breathing the same air in the darkness before dawn and war and whatever came after. When he kissed her, it was desperate and furious and tasted like fear and defiance in equal measure. She kissed back with the same intensity, fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. This wasn't romance. This was two people clinging to each other in the face of annihilation, choosing connection over isolation even knowing it made them vulnerable. They broke apart, breathing hard. If we survive this, his voice was rough. If we somehow make it through, we'll deal with what comes next when it comes. She cut him off. Right now we focus on not dying. Practical. I'm a cartographer. Practical is what I do. He almost laughed. Then his expression sobered. I need to get back. Final deployment checks before dawn. Go. I'll manage the civilian side. He moved toward the door, then paused. Sable, whatever happens, whatever this costs, I don't regret it. Any of it. Neither do I. He left and she was alone with 3 hours until dawn and the growing certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. She didn't sleep. Instead, she prepared, checked supply manifests, reviewed evacuation routes, made contingency plans for scenarios she prayed wouldn't happen. Dawn came gray and cold, turning the fortress into sharp angles and hard shadows. The evacuation began at first light, families streaming through the gates with whatever possessions they could carry. Children crying, parents trying to maintain composure while terror leaked through anyway. The militia fighters moving in the opposite direction. Toward the mountains. Toward engagement zones. Toward death that statistics said most of them wouldn't avoid. Sable stood at the gates with Elena and Mira directing refugee flow, organizing temporary housing, trying to create order from chaos. A woman grabbed her arm. Where's my husband? He left with the militia 3 hours ago. When will he be back? I don't know. The honest answer. The brutal one. But we're doing everything we can to bring everyone home. The woman's face crumpled, but she nodded. Moved on. Joined the stream of displaced people flooding into a fortress that was rapidly becoming the last refuge between the clans and total conquest. By midday, they'd processed 800 refugees. The barracks were overcrowded. The medical wing was preparing for casualties that hadn't arrived yet. And Kaelin was somewhere in the mountains, positioning forces for engagement that would determine everything. Astrid found Sable coordinating food distribution. We have a problem. We have 12 problems. Which one? The scouts just reported. The Frostmark flanking forces. They're not using the secondary passes we predicted. They found different routes, ones that put them behind our defensive positions. Sable's stomach dropped. They have better intelligence than we thought, or someone's feeding them current tactical information. Astrid's expression was grim. Someone who knows our deployment plans, who can update them in real time as we adjust positions. A spy, in our forces, or our council, or our command structure. Astrid's voice was tight. Someone with access to strategic information who's decided selling it is preferable to dying for a losing cause. Can we identify them? Not without time we don't have. The flanking forces will be in position within hours. If we don't reposition our militia, they'll be surrounded and slaughtered. Then we reposition. With what authority? Your civilian governance. Military deployment is Kaelin's domain, and he's in the field with limited communication. Then get him communication. Use signal fires, messenger riders, whatever it takes. He needs to know his tactical advantage just evaporated. Astrid was already moving. I'll send riders. But Sable, if we have a spy feeding information to the clans, nothing we plan is secure. Every strategy gets compromised before we execute it. Then we plan in person. Small groups, trusted people only, and we start assuming everything we do is being watched. That's paranoia. That's survival. Astrid left, and Sable stood in the courtyard surrounded by refugees and the knowledge that they were fighting blind. Someone inside their own structure was working against them, feeding intelligence to enemies, ensuring that every move they made was countered before it landed. It was methodical, calculated, the kind of betrayal that required planning and proximity and absolutely no conscience. She was still processing implications when one of the new counselors, Davos, the former military captain, found her. "We have a situation in the southern barracks." His voice was tight. 2 refugee families claiming the same housing allocation. "It's getting violent." She followed him through corridors that echoed with displaced people and organized chaos. The southern barracks had been converted into temporary housing, but the conversion was failing under pressure. Too many people. Not enough space. Desperation making people aggressive. The 2 families were screaming at each other when she arrived. A man with a bleeding nose. A woman holding a child and brandishing a kitchen knife. 20 other refugees watching with the tense attention of people one provocation away from riot. Sable stepped between them. "Enough." The woman with the knife turned on her. "You don't understand. We were promised housing. We left everything. And now they're saying—" "I understand perfectly." Sable's voice cut through the noise. "You're terrified, displaced, watching everything you know burn while bureaucrats shuffle papers and make promises they can't keep. But turning on each other doesn't solve anything. It just makes you easier to destroy." The woman lowered the knife fractionally. "Then what do we do?" "You share the space. You make it work. Because in approximately 12 hours, wounded fighters are going to start arriving from the northern engagement. And if we're still arguing about housing allocation instead of organizing medical support, people die. Real people. Your husbands, your sons, the militia fighters defending your homes." The courtyard went silent. Sable turned to address everyone. "I know this is impossible. I know you're scared and angry, and you have every right to be. But we're all we have. The Empire's government fractured. Half the council resigned or fled. We're rebuilding from nothing while fighting invasion and economic siege and internal betrayal. So we can either tear each other apart or we can survive together. Choose." The woman handed the knife to her husband. "We'll share the space." The other family nodded agreement, and the tension bled out of the courtyard like water from a broken seal. Davos waited until the crowd dispersed. That was well done. That was desperation wearing a leadership mask. Same thing, usually. He studied her with the careful attention of someone reassessing initial judgment. "You've changed since the briefing yesterday. Have I? Yesterday you were uncertain, asking questions. Today you're giving orders like you've been governing for years. Today, people are dying if I don't." She met his gaze. "Turns out, survival is a great motivator for competence, or a great revealer of capability that was already there." He moved toward the exit. "The council's meeting in 2 hours. Emergency session to address the spy situation and Southern Territory negotiations with House Varn. I'll be there." She spent the intervening time organizing medical supplies and trying not to calculate how many wounded they were about to receive. The numbers were brutal, even if the ambush tactics worked. Even if the militia managed to slow the clan advance, casualties were guaranteed. The council session was tense, just the core group, Elena, Davos, Mira, Petra, and Marcus. Astrid attending as military liaison. Maps spread across the table showing revised clan positions and compromised defensive strategies. "We have a spy." Astrid didn't soften it. Someone with access to tactical planning who's feeding real-time intelligence to Frostmark commanders. Until we identify and eliminate them, every strategy we deploy is compromised before execution. "How do we find them?" Petra's voice shook. "We don't. Not in time to matter." Marcus's military experience showed. Spy hunting requires investigation and surveillance we can't conduct during active combat. The best we can do is limit information access and hope it slows the leak. That's not a strategy. That's hoping the problem resolves itself. "You have a better option." Marcus's voice was sharp. "Because I'm open to suggestions that don't involve abandoning battlefield coordination to chase ghosts." The argument escalated and Sable watched the council fracture in real time. Fear and pressure and impossible situations turning colleagues into combatants. She let it run for 30 seconds, then slammed her hand on the table hard enough to make Maps jump. "Enough." Her voice cut through the noise. We don't have time for this. The spy exists. We can't find them immediately. So we adapt. We compartmentalize information. We use coded signals for field communication. We assume compromise and build redundancy into every strategy. That's inefficient. Inefficient and alive beats efficient and dead. She looked at each of them. We're not going to solve every problem perfectly. We're going to solve them adequately and keep moving, because static targets get destroyed and we're already vulnerable enough. The council went quiet. Elena spoke first. What do you need from us? Coordinate refugee support, medical preparation for casualties, supply chain management to keep both civilian and military operations functional. She pulled documents forward. These are your assignments. You have 6 hours to establish frameworks before wounded start arriving. They took the documents and dispersed. Elena lingering briefly. You're good at this. The governance, the crisis management. I'm terrified and compensating with activity. Also good at that. She smiled slightly. We'll manage. After they left, Astrid remained. Kalen's asking for you. Where is he? Northern Command Post. 3 hours ride. He wants tactical consultation before engaging the clan advance forces. Sable's pulse spiked. He's asking me to help plan military engagement. I'm a cartographer, not a... You're someone who sees terrain differently than military strategists, who understands pressure points and flow patterns. Astrid's expression was serious. He needs that perspective, especially with our intelligence compromised. 3 hours there, 3 back. That's 6 hours I should be managing civilian operations. Davos can handle it. This is more important. They left within the hour. Just Sable and Astrid and 2 guards riding hard through forest that was starting to feel hostile. Every shadow could hide enemies. Every sound could be advanced scouts reporting their position. The command post was a fortified position on a ridge overlooking the main pass. Kalen stood surrounded by maps and militia commanders, looking like he hadn't slept in days. When he saw Sable, something in his expression eased fractionally. I need your eyes on this. He gestured to the map. The flanking forces changed routes. Our ambush positions are compromised. I need to know if there are alternative choke points we haven't considered. She studied the terrain with cartographer's focus, saw patterns the military training might overlook. Water flow, elevation changes, vegetation density that indicated unstable ground. Here, she pointed. This ridge. It's limestone. Same formation as the caves we surveyed. If we can trigger a controlled collapse, we can block the eastern flank's advance, force them back into the main column. That's risky. One of the commanders frowned. Controlled collapses aren't controllable. You might bury our own forces. Or we might buy 12 hours for repositioning. Kalen saw it immediately. 12 hours to establish new ambush points before they adapt. It's a gamble. Everything is a gamble. He turned to Astrid. Can your demolition specialist trigger limestone collapse without killing our militia in the process? Probably. Her voice was dry. Define probably. 60% confidence. I'll take those odds. Kalen looked at the assembled commanders. We move in 3 hours. Demolition team establishes position. Militia redeploys to secondary ambush points. And when the clan flanking force hits that ridge, we bring it down on their heads. The commanders disperse to execute orders, and Sable found herself alone with Kalen and Astrid, and the weight of having just helped plan an operation that would either save hundreds of lives or get them all killed. Kalen moved to stand beside her. Thank you. For what? Suggesting we bury people under a mountain. For seeing options I couldn't. His voice was quiet. Military training teaches you to think in formations and supply lines. You think in geography and systems. We need both. Before she could respond, a scout burst into the command post, bloody, breathing hard. My lord, the main clan force. They're not waiting for the flanking units. They're pushing through the pass now, full advance. There'll be an engagement range within 2 hours. The timeline had just collapsed. No time for repositioning. No time for the demolition team to establish. No time for anything except immediate response. Kalen's expression went absolutely cold. How many? 2,000. Maybe more. Full battle formation. He turned to Astrid. Recall the flanking militia, everyone to defensive positions around the pass. We're not doing guerrilla warfare anymore. My lord, if we concentrate forces there, we don't have a choice. The timeline just became binary. We either stop them at the pass or they march straight to Blackwater Keep. That's suicide. We don't have enough fighters. Then we make enough. He looked at Sable and something in his eyes made her breath catch. Get back to the fortress. Prepare for siege. If we fail here, you'll have maybe 12 hours before they reach the gates. No, she grabbed his arm. I'm not leaving. You are. Because someone needs to organize final evacuation. Burn the documents. Get the children out. He pulled her close, voice dropping to something only she could hear. Please, I need to know you're safe. I can't fight effectively if I'm worried about you being in the blast radius. The desperation in his voice broke something inside her. Fine, but you come back. You hear me. You don't die heroically in some mountain pass. You fight dirty and mean and you come back. I'll try. Not good enough. Promise. He looked at her for a long moment, then kissed her hard. Furious. The kind of kiss that felt like goodbye. I promise to try. That's all I can give you. She left with Astrid and the guards, riding back toward the fortress while behind her, Kaelin prepared to defend a pass with 1/3 the forces necessary. The ride back was silent. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say. The mathematics were brutal and everyone knew it. They reached Blackwater Keep as sunset turned the fortress into sharp shadows and blood-red light. Sable found the council immediately. Prepare for siege. We have 12 hours. Maybe less. The siege preparations began with the mechanical efficiency of people who'd stopped questioning and started executing. Reinforcing gates, positioning defenders on walls, moving the most vulnerable refugees into the central keep. Night fell, and reports started trickling in from the northern pass. Engagement initiated. Heavy casualties on both sides. Militia holding position but sustaining losses. Clan forces regrouping for second push. Each report was clinical. Detached. Numbers instead of names because names made it impossible to keep functioning. Somewhere around midnight, the reports stopped coming. Sable stood on the battlements, staring north toward mountains she couldn't see in the darkness. Imagining fire and steel and bodies falling. Imagining Kaelin fighting with everything he had against odds that didn't care about conviction or strategy. Elena found her there. No news. No news. That could be good. Or it could mean communications cut. That they're overwhelmed. That she couldn't finish the sentence. They stood together in the dark. Two women who'd been thrust into positions they weren't prepared for, governing an empire that was falling apart while the person who'd believed in them fought to keep it from collapsing completely. Dawn was maybe 4 hours away, if it came at all. The horizon was still dark when the first sounds reached them. Not reports, not messengers. Drums, war drums, coming from the north, getting closer. The war drums grew louder with each passing second, a rhythmic thunder that seemed to shake the stone beneath Sable's feet. She stood frozen on the battlements, hands gripping cold stone, while beside her, Elena's face had gone pale as bone. That sound. Elena's voice was barely audible. I've heard it before. During the Western campaigns 15 years ago. That's Frostmark victory drums. Sable's chest tightened until breathing became conscious effort, which means the pass fell. Elena's words came out flat, clinical. The way people speak when emotion would shatter them. They broke through our defensive positions. Kaelin's forces either retreated or... Don't. Sable cut her off. Don't finish that sentence. But the unspoken words hung between them anyway. Retreated or died. Those were the only options when drums like that announced conquest. Below in the courtyard, refugees were stirring, waking to the sound of approaching doom. Children crying. Parents trying to maintain composure while terror leaked through the cracks. The militia fighters who'd stayed to defend the fortress were assembling at the gates, faces grim with the knowledge that 800 defenders couldn't hold walls against 2,000 battle-hardened clan warriors. Astrid appeared on the battlements, moving fast despite the shoulder wound that had barely healed. Her expression told Sable everything before words did. Scouts just returned from the northern approach. The pass engagement lasted 4 hours. Our militia held longer than projected, but the numbers, she paused, jaw tight. Kaelin ordered retreat when casualties reached 60%. The survivors are falling back toward the fortress, but the clans are pursuing. They'll be here by dawn. And Kaelin. Sable's voice sounded strange to her own ears. Distant. like someone else was speaking, leading the retreat. Last confirmed sighting had him covering the withdrawal with a rear guard of 30 fighters. Astrid met her gaze. He's alive. For now. The relief was so intense it felt like physical pain. Alive meant possibility. Alive meant the drums were victory celebration, not funeral march. Alive meant there was still something to fight for. How long until they reach us? Elena's practical mind was already calculating. 2 hours. Maybe 3 if the rear guard can slow pursuit. Astrid moved to the wall's edge, scanning the dark forest. We need to prepare for siege or evacuation. King's choice. But he's not here to make it. Then we make it for him. Sable heard herself say it before conscious thought caught up. He trusted us to govern. This is governing. We choose survival strategy and execute it before the choice becomes irrelevant. Astrid studied her with that same assessing look she'd worn when they first met. You're proposing to override royal authority. I'm proposing to use the authority he gave us. Sable turned to face both of them. Kaelin's fighting to buy us time. We waste that time waiting for permission we don't need, so we decide. Now, siege or evacuation? What gives the most people the best chance of surviving? Elena spoke first. Siege means we're trapped. If the walls fall, everyone dies. No escape routes, no alternatives. Evacuation means we abandon the fortress. Astrid's voice was hard. Blackwater Keep is the strategic heart of Stormfall. Lose it, and the Empire fractures completely. Every territory governor will declare independence. The clans will establish permanent occupation. So we're choosing between people and symbols. Sable looked between them. Between refugee lives and Empire integrity. Tell me which matters more. The silence was heavy. Then Astrid nodded slowly. People. We evacuate. The Empire means nothing if everyone who believes in it is dead. Elena exhaled shakily. Agreed. But where do we go? The clans will pursue. And we have 800 civilians who can't move fast. South. Sable's mind was already mapping routes. Through the forest toward the border with House Varn territory. It's risky. We'll be refugees on their land, but Varn wants leverage, not genocide. They'll negotiate. You're betting our survival on the mercy of people who suspended trade agreements and demanded we restore child trafficking. Astrid's skepticism was evident. I'm betting on their self-interest. Dead refugees have no negotiating value. Live ones can be used for political pressure. Sable moved toward the stairs. We have 2 hours. Maybe 3. Start evacuation immediately. Priority to children, elderly, and wounded. Everyone else grabs what they can carry and moves. What about the fighters? Elena's voice shook. The ones retreating with Kaelin. If we evacuate, we abandon them. We leave guides at rally points, markers showing the evacuation route. They're mobile and armed. They can follow once they break contact with pursuit. Sable was moving now, descending stairs 2 at a time. But the civilians leave first. No debate. The fortress transformed into controlled chaos. Astrid's security forces moving through barracks, pulling refugees from sleep. The new council organizing departure groups. Mira coordinating medical support for those who couldn't walk. Davos assigning militia fighters as rear guard to slow any clan forces that reached the fortress before evacuation completed. Sable found Tam in the children's barracks, curled against Kira, who was already awake and armed. We're leaving. Sable kept her voice calm despite the urgency screaming in her chest. Can you walk? Tam nodded, small face determined despite the fear in his eyes. Where's the king? Coming. She hoped it wasn't a lie. He'll meet us at the rally point. She left Kira to organize the children and found Petra coordinating document destruction. The young counselor was methodically feeding papers into a brazier, watching Empire records turn to ash. Anything critical that can't be carried gets burned. Petra's voice was steadier than Sable expected. We're not leaving intelligence for the clans to use. Good thinking. Sable grabbed a stack of supply manifests and added them to the flames. When you're done, join the evacuation. You're in the second wave. What about you? I'm staying until the last group leaves. That's suicide. That's leadership. She met Petra's gaze. Someone has to coordinate. Make sure no one gets left behind. That someone is me. Petra looked like she wanted to argue. Instead, she nodded once and returned to burning documents. The evacuation began in the pre-dawn darkness. lines of refugees streaming south through the forest, guided by militia fighters who knew the terrain. Sable watched them go from the courtyard, counting heads, checking that the vulnerable were supported. 800 people. More than she'd expected. Less than she'd hoped. Elena appeared beside her. First wave is away. Second wave assembles in 20 minutes. And the rear guard. Davos has 50 fighters positioned between us and the northern approach. They'll delay any clan advance long enough for final evacuation. Then they pull back and follow. If they can pull back. If they can. Elena's voice was grim. Some of them know they're choosing how they die, not whether. The weight of it settled on Sable's shoulders. These weren't abstract casualties. These were people with names and families and lives that were about to end because she'd made a strategic calculation. This is what Kaelin had tried to warn her about. The cost of governance. The way leadership turned people into numbers and choices, into body counts, and you just had to keep functioning while the weight crushed you. She kept functioning. The second wave departed as gray light started filtering through the trees. Fewer people this time, mostly the mobile fighters who could move fast if pursuit caught them. Sable watched them disappear into the forest and then turned to face the fortress. Blackwater Keep stood dark and empty. The obsidian walls that had seemed so imposing a week ago now felt like a monument to something dying. She thought about Kaelin's father, about the empire built on calculated brutality, about systems that required atrocity to maintain themselves. Maybe this was what collapse looked like. Not dramatic destruction, but quiet abandonment. Walking away from power because the cost of maintaining it had become too high. Astrid found her standing in the empty courtyard. Last group assembles in 10 minutes. You need to be with them. What about Kaelin's rear guard? Any word? Nothing. Communications cut. Astrid's expression was carefully neutral. They're either still fighting or they're not. Sable moved through the fortress one final time. Through the great hall where she'd first stood on trial. Past the council chamber where Marin had bled out. Up to the room where Kaelin had stood at her window and admitted he was terrified of becoming his father. The pendant he'd given her was still around her neck, silver catching the gray dawn light. She touched it briefly, then turned and left. The last evacuation group was assembled at the south gate. 20 people, mostly council members and essential personnel. Mira, Petra, Marcus looking grim and resigned, and standing slightly apart, the 7 children she'd freed from chains a lifetime ago. Tam broke from the group and ran to her. You're coming now. I'm coming. Promise. Promise. They left through gates that would never close again. Left the fortress to silence and approaching drums. Left the heart of an empire because survival mattered more than symbols. The forest swallowed them. They'd been moving for maybe an hour when the scouts reported back. Kaelin's rear guard had broken contact with clan pursuit and was making for the rally point, estimated arrival 30 minutes. Relief flooded through Sable so intensely her knees went weak. Elena caught her arm, steadying her. He made it. He's not safe yet, but he's alive. The rally point was a clearing 3 miles south of the fortress where the evacuation groups were supposed to consolidate before the final push to Varn territory. Sable's group arrived to find it already crowded with refugees, exhausted, terrified, but alive. She was organizing water distribution when the rear guard emerged from the trees. 30 fighters, maybe fewer, moving like people who'd used up every reserve and were running on nothing but will. Bloodied, limping, eyes hollowed out by whatever they'd seen in that mountain pass. And in the center, leaning on Davos for support, Kaelin. He looked worse than Sable had ever seen him, uniform torn and bloody, face pale beneath grime and exhaustion, a crude bandage wrapped around his left arm where something had cut deep, but his eyes were still sharp, still calculating. He saw her and something in his expression cracked. She met him halfway, hands reaching for his face, checking for injuries beyond the obvious. You're alive. Barely. His voice was rough, raw from shouting orders or breathing smoke or both. The pass, I know, Astrid told me, we lost. He said it flatly. Couldn't hold. The numbers, you saved who you could. That's enough. Is it? Because it doesn't feel like enough. His gaze swept the clearing full of refugees. Doesn't feel like victory. It's not victory. It's survival. And survival is what you bought us. She kept her hands on his face, forcing him to look at her. You held them long enough for evacuation. Got your people out. That matters. I abandoned the fortress. You saved 800 lives by ceding the strategic heart of Stormfall to enemy occupation, by choosing people over symbols. She cut him off. That's what you taught me. That empires mean nothing if everyone who believes in them is dead. He closed his eyes briefly and she saw the weight he was carrying. Not just the battle, not just the casualties, but the knowledge that he'd gambled an empire on conscience and lost. When he opened his eyes again, something had shifted, hardened. Where are we going? Varn territory, southern border. We're betting they'll negotiate for refugees rather than slaughter them. That's a significant bet. All we have left are significant bets. She stepped back, letting him stand on his own. The council made the decision. I executed it. If you want to overrule, no. His voice was firm. You made the right call. I trust it. The words settled something in her chest, validation from someone who'd spent his life making impossible choices, who understood what it cost to gamble on survival instead of dying for pride. Astrid materialized from the crowd. My lord, we need to move. Scouts report clan forces reached the fortress an hour ago. When they find it empty, they'll pursue. How long until they catch us? With 800 refugees, 6 hours, maybe less. Her expression was grim. We need to reach Varn territory before that, establish negotiating position before we're running from active pursuit. Then we move now? Kaelin's voice carried command despite exhaustion. Spread word. Anyone who can't keep pace gets carried. We don't leave wounded behind. The evacuation resumed with renewed urgency. The forest became an endless succession of trees and streams and terrain that seemed designed to slow desperate people. Children crying, elderly stumbling, wounded being carried on makeshift stretchers. Sable walked near the front with Kaelin and the council, monitoring pace and watching for signs of collapse. Beside her, Tam held her hand with the fierce grip of someone who'd learned that letting go meant disappearing. Elena dropped back from the lead group. We have a problem. Of course we do. Kaelin's voice was tired. What kind? The Varn border. It's fortified. Guards, barriers. They're not letting refugees through without negotiation. Then we negotiate. With what leverage? We're 800 desperate people fleeing invasion. We have nothing they want. We have information. Sable's mind raced. About Frostmark battle tactics, clan deployment strategies, the kind of military intelligence Varn would pay for if the clans decide to push south after consolidating Stormfall. That's thin. It's what we have. They reached the border 2 hours later, a cleared zone with wooden barriers and armed guards wearing Varn colors. Behind them, the forest gave way to cultivated fields and the distant outline of a fortress that looked nothing like Blackwater's brutal geometry. The guard captain was a woman in her 40s, with the bearing of someone who'd seen enough conflict to be skeptical of refugees claiming persecution. She studied the approaching mass of people with cold assessment. Kaelin stepped forward, and despite the exhaustion and blood and defeat, he still moved like a king. I need to speak with whoever commands this border post. You're speaking to her. The captain's voice was flat. And you're violating Varn territory with armed forces and refugees. Turn back or be turned back. We're requesting asylum. Kaelin kept his voice level. 800 civilians fleeing Frostmark invasion. We're not armed forces. We're survivors. You're the Stormfall king who voided our trade agreements and called our commerce atrocity. The captain's expression didn't change. Give me one reason I shouldn't refuse you and watch the clans finish what you started, because if the clans consolidate Stormfall, they'll push south next. Kaelin's gaze was steady. You think House Varn is safe because you're rich and connected. You're not. You're next on their expansion list and you're not prepared for the kind of warfare they practice. Bold claim from a king who just lost his empire. True claim from a commander who just fought them for 4 hours. He gestured to his bloodied rear guard. I can tell you their tactics, their vulnerabilities, the kind of intelligence that will save Varn lives when they inevitably turn their attention south. The captain considered this, then pulled a communication device from her belt and spoke quietly into it, a conversation Sable couldn't hear. When she finished, her expression had shifted fractionally. High Merchant Varn wants to negotiate. In person. She looked at Kaylin. Just you. The refugees stay here under guard until terms are established. No. Kaylin's voice was hard. I don't negotiate while my people are held hostage. Either we all come through or none of us do. Then none of you do. The captain's hand went to her weapon, and when the clans catch up, you can explain to them why pride was more important than survival. The standoff stretched taut. Then Sable stepped forward. I'll go. Kaylin turned sharply. Absolutely not. You're too valuable. If Varn decides to use you as leverage against the clans, we lose any negotiating position. She met his gaze. But I'm expendable. A cartographer who interfered with their trade agreements. They'll negotiate with me because I'm not worth using as a hostage. You're not expendable. Oh, to you I'm not. To them I am. She turned to the captain. I'll negotiate on behalf of King Kaylin and the Stormfall refugees. Let the others through to a secure holding area. If negotiations fail, you can send us all back. The captain studied her with calculating eyes, then nodded. Agreed. You come with me. The others wait in the processing area. Sable followed the captain through barriers into Varn territory. Behind her, she heard Kaylin's voice raised in protest, and Astrid's quieter tones talking him down. Then they were too far away to hear. The Varn command post was a study in merchant efficiency. Clean, organized, built for commerce rather than warfare. High Merchant Varn sat behind a desk that probably cost more than most territories' annual tax revenue, studying reports with the focused attention of someone who measured everything in gold. He looked up when Sable entered, dismissed the captain with a gesture, then leaned back in his chair and smiled with all the warmth of a predator calculating how to best consume prey. The cartographer who started this mess. His voice was cultured, educated, the kind of polish that came from generations of wealth. I've been curious about you. The woman who made a king forget pragmatism. I didn't make him forget anything. I reminded him what pragmatism in service of atrocity looks like from the ground level. Philosophical. He gestured to a chair. Sit, we have much to discuss. She remained standing. We're requesting asylum for 800 refugees. In exchange, we offer military intelligence about Frostmark tactics and strategic consultation about how to defend against their inevitable southern expansion. Generous offer. Varn's smile widened. Except you're in no position to negotiate. I could refuse asylum. Watch the clans slaughter you, then offer the survivors slavery contracts and call it rescue. You could. She kept her voice steady despite the fear. But that would make you exactly what King Kaylin accused you of being. And more importantly, it would waste valuable intelligence and guarantee that when the clans come south, you're unprepared. The clans won't come south. We have agreements. The clans break agreements when it suits them. Same as every power structure. She moved closer to the desk. You're betting your security on treaties with people who just invaded an empire they'd supposedly been at peace with for 3 years. That's not strategy, that's wishful thinking. Varn's expression hardened. You're very bold for someone asking for mercy. I'm not asking for mercy. I'm offering a transaction, information for shelter, strategic consultation for safety. Both sides benefit. That's commerce, which I'm told is your specialty. He studied her in silence, then reached for a document, sliding it across the desk. These are our terms. Read them. She read. The terms were brutal. Asylum granted in exchange for complete strategic intelligence. Refugees would be housed in work camps with mandatory labor to offset costs. King Kaylin would formally cede sovereignty claims on northern territories occupied by Frostmark forces. And House Varn would retain right to renegotiate trade agreements with Stormfall remnant territories at significantly favorable terms. It was exploitation wrapped in legal language. Slavery by another name. Everything Kaylin had fought to dismantle. She looked up. No. Varn's eyebrows rose. No. These terms reduce refugees to unpaid labor and forced territorial concession that legitimizes Frostmark occupation. We reject them. Then you reject asylum. Then we find another option. There is no other option. Varn's voice was cold. The clans are hours behind you. No other territory will accept 800 refugees. You're choosing death over reasonable terms. Your terms aren't reasonable. They're predatory. She pushed the document back. Counteroffer. We provide intelligence in exchange for temporary housing. No forced labor. no territorial concessions. Refugees retain freedom of movement and can renegotiate their status after 3 months. That's absurd. That's fair commerce. You get valuable intelligence that will save lives when the clans inevitably violate whatever agreements you think protect you. We get safety without selling ourselves into bondage. Both sides benefit without either being exploited. Varn laughed, sharp, bitter. You really don't understand how power works, do you? I understand perfectly. Power without conscience is just brutality with contracts. She met his gaze. King Kalen refused to maintain that system, refused to let children be trafficked under legal agreements, refused to call atrocity pragmatic. He lost his empire for that refusal. But he didn't lose his integrity. Noble. Varn's voice dripped sarcasm. Also irrelevant. Integrity doesn't feed refugees, doesn't house them, doesn't protect them from clan invasion. No. But commerce does. And commerce based on mutual benefit instead of exploitation actually lasts. She leaned forward. You want Stormfall to fail. Want to prove that conscience-based governance can't survive. But if we succeed, if we rebuild on different foundations, we become competition. An empire that doesn't require trafficking to maintain trade relationships. That's threatening to your entire business model. So you're asking me to help you destroy my own power structure. I'm asking you to evolve it before it collapses under its own corruption. The silence that followed was heavy. Then Varn stood, moving to the window that overlooked his territory. When he spoke, his voice had lost its edge. Become something quieter, almost thoughtful. You know what the real cost of the old agreements was? Not the children, not the trafficking, but the fact that we'd all agreed to pretend it was necessary, that we'd built such complex justifications we actually believed them. He turned back. Your king made us look at what we'd become, and we hated him for it. Because seeing is painful and ignorance is comfortable, then stop choosing comfort. Choose evolution. I'm a merchant. I choose profit. Profit and evolution aren't mutually exclusive. She moved to stand beside him. Help us rebuild. Be the territory that proved commerce and conscience can coexist. The intelligence alone is worth more than forced labor. And the goodwill, the proof that House Varn chose different, that's valuable in ways your current business model can't measure. He was quiet for a long time. Then he pulled fresh parchment forward and began writing. Revised terms. Intelligence for 6 months temporary housing. Freedom of movement. No forced labor. After 6 months, we renegotiate based on refugee integration and Stormfall's reconstruction progress. He slid the document across and Sable read it carefully. The terms weren't perfect, but they were fair, survivable. She signed. When she emerged from the command post, dawn had fully broken. The refugees were gathered in a processing area behind the barriers, guarded but not imprisoned. Kalen saw her first, breaking from the crowd. The terms. His voice was tight, fair, 6 months asylum, no forced labor. She handed him the signed agreement. We have breathing room. The relief in his expression was absolute. He pulled her close, forehead pressed against hers, and she felt him shaking with exhaustion and emotion and the weight finally lifting fractionally. You did it. We did it. She stepped back. Now we figure out what comes next. What came next was slow and painful, and nothing like the stories made survival sound. The refugees were processed into temporary housing in converted merchant warehouses. Not comfortable, not permanent, but safe. Protected from immediate threat while longer-term solutions could be developed. The council met in a cramped room that smelled like stored grain and exhaustion. 8 people trying to govern an empire that no longer existed in any formal sense. Kalen sat at the head of the table, looking like he'd aged a decade in the past week. Astrid delivered the intelligence report with clinical efficiency. Frostmark clans have occupied Blackwater Keep and established forward operating positions throughout northern Stormfall. They're consolidating control and haven't pushed south yet, probably assessing whether further expansion is worth the cost. So we have time. Elena's voice carried hope. We have a window, Astrid corrected. Maybe weeks, maybe months, until they decide the southern territories are vulnerable enough to take. What about our territories? Petra asked. The ones the clans haven't occupied. Are they still loyal? Complicated question. Marcus pulled a map forward. 7 southern territories. 3 have declared independence. 2 are negotiating with House Varn. 2 sent delegations asking for guidance. From a king with no fortress and no army. Kalen's voice was flat. What guidance can I give them? The same guidance you gave us. Davos spoke for the first time. Evolve or die. Build something better than what collapsed. With what resources? We're refugees. We have no tax base, no military, no governance infrastructure. We have conviction. Sable heard herself say it. And people who believe that conviction matters, the territories that stayed loyal, the militia fighters who survived, the counselors who chose to rebuild instead of fleeing, that's not nothing. It's not enough. Maybe not. But it's what we have. She looked around the table. So we build from that. We prove that governance based on conscience instead of exploitation can work, even if it's hard, even if it takes years. And if we fail, Mira's voice was quiet. If the clans push south, if the territories fracture beyond recovery, what then? Then we fail having tried something worth attempting. Kalen's voice was steady. I'd rather collapse building something new than survive maintaining something rotten. The council worked through scenarios for hours. Resource allocation for refugees, communication with loyal territories, intelligence gathering on clan intentions, diplomatic outreach to other kingdoms that might see Stormfall refugees as opportunity rather than burden. It was grinding and exhausting, and nothing produced easy answers. But slowly, frameworks emerged. Not solutions, just structures that might support eventual solutions if they held long enough. Night fell, and the council dispersed to their temporary quarters. Sable found herself walking through the refugee camp, checking that the vulnerable had shelter and food. The children were housed together under Kira's protection. Tam saw her and waved from where he was helping distribute blankets. How are you? Tired. But okay. He moved closer. Are we staying here? For now. And then, I don't know. She touched his head gently. But wherever we go together. Promise. Promise. She left him with Kira and found her way to the small room she'd been assigned, barely large enough for a bed and a desk. Nothing like the quarters at Blackwater, but private. Safe. She was sitting on the bed, too tired to undress, when someone knocked. Kalen stood in the corridor, still in his bloodied uniform, looking as exhausted as she felt. Can I come in? She moved aside and he entered, closing the door behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, just stood in the small space, processing everything that had happened. We lost. He said it quietly. The Empire. The fortress. Everything my father built. You saved 800 people. Built a council that actually functions. Proved that governance can evolve. By fleeing into refugee status and begging for asylum. By choosing survival over pride. She moved closer. Your father would have died defending that fortress. Called it honor. You chose differently. He was silent for a long moment, then sank onto the bed, head in his hands. I don't know how to do this. How to govern without infrastructure. How to rebuild from nothing, the same way you've done everything else. You make impossible choices and live with the consequences. She sat beside him. You taught me that. I taught you wrong. No. You taught me that leadership isn't about having answers. It's about facing uncertainty and choosing action over paralysis. He looked at her and something in his expression cracked. The careful control giving way to raw vulnerability. I'm terrified. Me too. I don't know if this works. If we can actually rebuild. If conscience-based governance is sustainable or just beautiful theory that collapses under pressure. Neither do I. But we try anyway. He pulled her close and she went, wrapping around him like they could shield each other from the weight they carried. They stayed like that for a long time. Two people who'd gambled everything on the possibility of something better and were still waiting to see if the bet would pay off. When he spoke again, his voice was muffled against her shoulder. Thank you. For what? For not letting me become my father. For forcing me to choose conscience when calculation would have been easier. For sharing this impossible weight. That's what partners do. We're partners. You promised. Remember. He pulled back enough to look at her face. I remember everything, every choice, every casualty, every moment when I could have turned back and didn't because you were there reminding me what we were fighting for. Was it worth it? The question hung between them. Heavy. Unanswerable. Ask me in a year. His voice was quiet. When we know if this survives or collapses, if refugees become citizens or corpses, if the territories rebuild or fracture beyond recovery. Fair enough. They fell asleep like that, exhausted and uncertain and clinging to each other in the darkness. Outside, the refugee camp settled into uneasy rest. Guards patrolled, children dreamed, and somewhere to the north, Frostmark forces consolidated occupation of an empire that had chosen evolution and paid the price. Morning came gray and cold. Sable woke to find Kaelin already gone, probably meeting with commanders or territory delegates or whoever needed governing at dawn. She dressed in clothes that weren't hers and went to find the council. They met in the grain warehouse, surrounded by refugees who were waking to their first full day of displacement. Elena had organized a meal distribution system. Mira was running medical checks. Davos was coordinating security. The machinery of governance grinding forward despite having no formal structure. Astrid arrived with news. The two loyal territories sent delegations. They're here, asking for guidance about whether to resist clan expansion or negotiate terms. Kaelin looked at Sable. You want to take this? She nodded. Brought me here to govern. Might as well start. The delegates were a merchant from Westmarch and a former military officer from Greyhaven. Both looked skeptical of taking direction from refugees. Sable didn't blame them. She met them in a side room that smelled like stored wheat in desperation. Spread maps on a table that had probably been used for commerce negotiations. You're asking whether to fight or negotiate. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. The answer depends on what you're willing to risk. We're willing to risk fighting. The Westmarch merchant's voice was firm. But not if it's suicide. If King Kaelin has a strategy, he doesn't. She cut him off. The king has conviction and people willing to die for it, but strategy requires resources we don't currently have. So here's what I can offer. Intelligence about clan tactics, coordination between loyal territories for mutual defense, and a framework for governance that doesn't require trafficking or exploitation to function. That's theoretical. Everything is theoretical until we try it. She met their gazes. The empire that just collapsed was built on pragmatism that justified atrocity. We're trying to build something different. It might fail. Probably will fail. But if you're asking whether it's worth attempting, my answer is yes. The Greyhaven officer leaned forward. And if we try and it costs us everything, if the clans overrun us because we chose your idealism over their pragmatism, then you die having tried to build something worth preserving. Better than living under something that slowly corrupts everyone inside it. The delegates exchanged glances, calculating, weighing options that all involved risk. Finally, the merchant nodded. We'll coordinate. Share intelligence. Try your governance framework. But if it fails, if casualties get unsustainable, we reserve the right to negotiate our own terms. Agreed. They left and Sable collapsed into the chair, exhaustion hitting like a physical blow. This was what governance looked like from the ground up. Not grand strategy, but grinding negotiation with people who had every right to be skeptical. Kaelin found her there an hour later, still sitting, staring at maps that showed territories fragmenting. How did it go? They'll try. She looked up. They don't trust us, but they'll try. That's more than I expected. Me too. He sat across from her, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Two people who'd started this journey with him as a king, questioning his empire, and her as a cartographer cutting chains. Now they were refugees trying to rebuild from rubble. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. Any of it. She thought about Tam and the other children, about the council that functioned, about refugees who had shelter instead of chains, about an empire that had chosen to collapse rather than perpetuate atrocity. No. Her voice was firm. I regret the casualties, the people who died, the families torn apart, but I don't regret the choice. Don't regret that we tried, even knowing what it cost, especially knowing what it cost, because the cost of not trying would have been worse. She reached across the table, taking his hand. We're not done. This isn't ending. It's transforming. Into what? Something new. Maybe something better. Or maybe something that proves conscience-based governance can't survive in a world built on exploitation. But at least we'll know. He squeezed her hand. Partners. Partners. The weeks that followed were brutal. Refugees integrated slowly into Varn territory. Some found work. Some didn't. Some chose to stay. Some left for other kingdoms. The council worked to maintain cohesion while everything fragmented around them. The loyal territories held against initial clan probing, barely. Casualties mounted, resources strained, and always the question, was this worth it? 3 months in, one of the territories fell. Not to military conquest, but to internal vote. The people decided resistance was too costly, negotiated their own terms with the clans. Kalen took the news without expression, but Sable saw it cost him. 2 months after that, House Varn renegotiated asylum terms. Not worse, actually better. They'd seen the intelligence value, seen that Stormfall refugees were assets rather than burdens, extended the asylum period indefinitely with pathways to citizenship, small victories, marginal gains, nothing like the sweeping transformation they'd hoped for. But the children were safe. The trafficking agreement stayed voided, and slowly, gradually, a framework emerged for governance that measured success in lives protected rather than territories controlled. It wasn't the empire Kalen had inherited. It was smaller, more fragile, built on cooperation instead of domination. But it was something. 6 months after the evacuation, Sable found Kalen on a hillside overlooking the refugee camp that was slowly becoming a community. He stood alone, watching the sun set over territory that wasn't his. She climbed the hill to stand beside him, thinking, always, about what? Whether this counts as success or just prolonged failure. She looked at the camp below, at children playing, at people building lives from scraps, at a council that still met daily to solve impossible problems. Survival isn't failure, she said it quietly. We're still here, still trying, still proving that governance can evolve. Some of the territories fell, some held, and the ones that held are building differently. Better. Is it enough? She thought about the question, about everything they'd lost and everything they'd protected, about empires that measured success in conquest versus communities that measured it in well-being. It's enough that we tried. She turned to face him. Your father built an empire on brutality and died alone and hollowed out. You built something on conscience and you're standing here with people who chose to fight for it. That's different. Different isn't better, isn't it? She gestured to the camp. Those people down there. They have choice, freedom, protection without selling themselves into bondage. That's better than what existed before. He was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Maybe. Definitely maybe. This time he smiled, real and unguarded. Progress. They stood together as darkness fell, watching lights appear in the camp below. Small fires, lanterns, the illumination of people building homes from displacement. Behind them, the ruins of an empire. Ahead, the possibility of something new. It wasn't the ending Sable had imagined when she cut those chains. Wasn't heroic or triumphant or complete. But it was honest, and honest was enough. Kalen took her hand as stars emerged overhead. Thank you. For what? For reminding me that true strength isn't about domination. It's about choosing what to protect, even when protection costs everything. That's what you taught me. Then we taught each other. They walked back down the hill toward the camp, toward council meetings and impossible logistics and the grinding work of rebuilding. Toward a future that was uncertain but no longer built on atrocity. An empire had fallen, but its people remained. And in the space between collapse and reconstruction, in the gap where old power structures died and new ones struggled to birth, they'd found something worth more than crowns or territory or domination. They'd found the courage to change, to choose conscience over calculation, to measure success in lives protected rather than enemies conquered. The Alpha's true reckoning wasn't learning to rule absolutely. It was learning when not to. And that choice, made in darkness and uncertainty and the ruins of everything familiar, turned out to be the most dangerous power of all, the kind that rebuilt worlds,